Oh my God.
I'm excited to talk about this book because, it's one of my favorite novels. It's just very enjoyable to read in a lot of ways to me. And I think some of that is just because a lot of it appeals to at least a part of my sense of humor. And maybe it does for you too, but I've always enjoyed Vonnegut's humor. And I think it's like in full flow in a lot of ways in this book. So.
Well, before we even get to like sort of describing the novel, the plot to the extent that it has any real plot to speak of, where would you rate this alongside his other books? Like, I guess we could start maybe what books of his have you read?
Yeah, so it is a little bit tough for me to answer that because I believe this is the case. I've only read in full 4 of his novels. So I've read, obviously, Breakfast of Champions, Cat's Cradle, Galapagos, and Slaughterhouse-Five a couple times. Mm-hmm. Maybe some of his short stories, and maybe there's another novel in there that I'm missing. But, out of those 4 that I can say for sure I've read in full, I'd put it number 2. I put Slaughterhouse-Five at the top for reasons that we can maybe discuss a little bit at least. Mm-hmm. But I would put this one number 2. And in a way, it kind of makes sense to me because if we look at, Vonnegut's career trajectory, those 2, Slaughterhouse-Five and Breakfast of Champions, happened back to back. And I think he really was hitting his prime. And it's right in the middle of his writing career, which was about 40 years long of his known published stuff. And you had, Cat's Cradle coming earlier. And definitely was what his first big success of any kind, right? From what I've read, he gained some notoriety off of that, and then Slaughterhouse and Breakfast of Champions kind of hit hard back to back, and then some years later he goes into Galapagos. So for my span of what I've read of his, I do feel like it ranks number 2, and then I'd probably put Cat's Cradle 3rd and Galapagos 4th. So, what about you?
I would actually.
Have you read?
I've read. What was it? It was Slaughterhouse-Five, Breakfast of Champions, Cat's Cradle, Mother Night. Mm-hmm. A bunch of his short stories. Actually, his short stories are they're surprisingly diverse, right? His novels aren't so diverse in the sense that they, stylistically they're pretty similar, right, to each other. The kind of humor is pretty similar, but perhaps it's because many of the earlier Vonnegut short stories were before he sort of hit his stride in terms of having a very kind of verifiable style, right? Like with a truly great artist, right? You always sort of know who it is, right? I mean, and with a lot of the short stories, he covers a lot of different territory, right? Some of the stories read even a little bit like an Irwin Shaw story sometimes. Some of the stories are, very kind of Vonnegut-esque, right? Others are others just do other things differently, right? So there were I think a couple other novels I'm forgetting now, but of the top 3, it would be Slaughterhouse-Five. Actually, number 2 for me would be Cat's Cradle. Number 3 would be Breakfast of Champions. Rereading this book, I think I read it for the first time maybe 4 years ago, and rereading it now, like in print form, I was actually slightly more disappointed in it compared to the first time that I read it. And you sort of talk about this in your notes, right? There's like a little bit of stuff that needs to get trimmed. Some of the controlling metaphors aren't as effective. Like when you look at the controlling metaphors in something like Slaughterhouse-Five or in Cat's Cradle, I don't think they're as effective. And one thing that you can't say with Cat's Cradle is like there's really nothing that you could really trim that much, right? Even like the individual little character interactions, even if they're sort of like, not very important characters, they all sort of construct this kind of edifice that all kind of congeals very neatly together. So
that's true. Yeah.
So I would not. I probably would have thought Breakfast of Champions a little bit higher when I first read it, but in a second reading, I think maybe some of the kind of like weirder elements of this novel made me rate it a little bit higher, right? Okay. Where they kind of maybe spoke to me a little more, or I thought maybe there was a little more to them than there is like in actuality upon rereading and closer inspection. Not to say that this isn't, an excellent novel, because it is. At minimum, I would say it's an excellent novel, but probably not a great one, or at least not great in the same category as Slaughterhouse-Five or Cat's Cradle, which I think are pretty similar to one another in terms of overall quality.
Gotcha. Yeah, well, and I do think that in the spirit of what you just talked about with Ethan, maybe in a sense, some parts of Breakfast of Champions they wear a little bit thin, or that's even a little bit kitsch with his illustrations and stuff, which I asked this question in the notes, and maybe I don't know if this is the only book that he's really employed the illustrations in, because I flipped through the other, I've got print editions of the other 3 books, and I have them right here with me.
We'll just show some of them as you're talking.
Yeah, sure. And I flipped through those books and I didn't see any illustrations. Maybe it's just something that, seeing so many of them in this one, it made me think, oh yeah, he's got illustrations in his other books too, but it doesn't look like he does. And he employs them a lot. In Breakfast of Champions, it's something's going to happen on, every 5th to 10th page almost, in terms of an illustration. So, that maybe it does wear a little bit thin. I think there's kind of like almost a little pop of childlike joy the first time you read this book, and the illustrations pop up. Yeah,
that's an illustration of an asshole,
right?
Right.
And so it's humorous and it catches you off guard, and it's as the number of things that Vonnegut does, it kind of set the stage for some elements of like avant-garde writing or postmodern writing that now I think writers have continued to try to latch onto and haven't done as successfully. But for me, definitely the first time I read Breakfast of Champions, it was definitely just entertaining and kind of a little pop of joy. But I do see how you could argue that that, along with some of the zanier elements of how he tells the tale here, could knock it down a couple notches, in terms of ranking. But still, overall, I think most of it's effective, most of it's good, and we'll dive more deeply into that. But yeah,
it's also not a knock, right? It's also not a knock on the like when he reaches like the heights, in this novel, for example. I mean, his social critique, right? His commentary, his jokes, right? They're not on a lower level, right, than anything else,
right?
There's tons of memorable stuff, like what was it? Something like, this character had a penis that was 30 miles long and 2 miles wide, but practically all of it was in the 4th dimension, right? Stuff like that. Like, it's just full of like really nice one-liners, and also just kind of extended paragraphs as well. So when it comes to like the heights of his writing, this book is comparable in its heights to pretty much anything else that he's written in that way.
Right.
I'd say.
Yeah, I would agree with that. Is there anything else just from Vonnegut's life and biographical information that you want to draw out? I highlighted a couple quick things in my notes that I think might be helpful or relevant for listeners and watchers. But
well, why don't you go over some of that in your notes, because I had a little bit of comments based on that.
Okay. Yeah, so I think that a number of people who would watch this and listen to it might be somewhat familiar with Vonnegut's life. He is a little bit imposed in American literary mythology at this point, I would say. He's a well-known writer. and a lot of people are familiar with him. But a couple of things that I just thought I would highlight. So first of all, he's of German descent. Both of his parents were fluent German speakers, but they decided not to teach him any German, and they purposefully steered him clear of like German culture, right? So German literature and poetry and that kind of thing, because of the anti-German sentiment in the United States after World War I, and they really wanted to, I guess, stand up as American patriots was their idea. And so Vonnegut, I think, would say later that left him feeling a little bit detached and like he was sort of floating. And his he was born in Indianapolis. His parents were part of Indianapolis high society in a way. So, their parents had done some things to gain wealth and status. And then I think his mom came from a family that owned a brewery in Indianapolis and were well off from that, fabulously well-to-do, as Vonnegut might say. But then after the Great Depression, they really lost a lot of that. And so his parents became bitter and withdrawn and seemed to really start to kind of like hate life and hate each other and bemoan their misfortune. His mom tried to regain their wealth and status, but wasn't successful with that. She also tried to write and publish some short stories, but she was never published. So she failed with that. But that does hint that he at least had a little bit of an artistic bent in his family. And then for Vonnegut himself, he became a soldier in World War II, and we know that a lot of his inspiration for Slaughterhouse-Five came from that, and some really direct experiences that he had. But later in life, he marries and has several children. His first wife eventually became, sounds like a devout Christian. So Vonnegut was, a free thinker and an atheist, and he stuck to that. She stuck to Christianity. So that was maybe the main wedge that started to drive them apart. And I think he was, around that time or shortly thereafter, he was trying to write Breakfast of Champions. And so, he really struggled to finish this novel and stopped writing it totally midway through and just left it, and eventually came back to it and finished it. But you can see that even in this work, there are some of those autobiographical elements with the interpersonal difficulties characters go through. He talks as the narrator about his mother committing suicide by taking too many sleeping pills, which is a real thing that happened in his life. So he has no problem interjecting a fair amount of himself into his work, and that comes through here. So yeah, there's other stuff we could talk about, but I thought those were some interesting anecdotes.
Yeah, I think, like you said, most people are already familiar with Vonnegut, so that's enough. But his early experiences, right, with this like anti sort of German sentiment. So much of his work, right, focuses on kind of like the silliness, not only of nationalism and patriotism, but also just kind of local sort of infatuations, like the whole Hoosier thing, right? He hates the concept of the Hoosier, right? Or that anyone would even dare invent something like that, right? Or to take it seriously. Right. So I could see how some of that possibly could have played a little bit into his writing. The fact that when it comes to like money, right? Like I say this all the time, and this is something that I'm exploring more in the novel that I'm writing now. The way that wealth is just so unbelievably random, right? His family is wealthy before the Great Depression. After the Great Depression, all that is depleted, and the sadness, right? The total sadness of trying to like build wealth again. I mean, that's just such a it always strikes me as a very kind of depressing enterprise, because, human beings are so, and this is kind of implied in this novel, but I want to maybe talk about it more here. Like human beings are just so kind of expensive to upkeep, right?
Yeah.
Like they require so much, and that's not, you see this all the time, right? When you walk down the street and it's like garbage day, and it's like one family, and look at how much trash a single family might produce in a week.
Right.
Look how much recycling you produce in a week. Look how much of anything you produce in a week. And that's because human beings, not only are they, larger than most animals, they just require a lot more upkeep in terms of like, psychological well-being, what we need in terms of our comforts, right? When I, for example, look at my cat or whatever and see how little she requires, right? Or how little other animals require, or you see other animals, like struggling somewhere on the street or whatever, and they never seem to get depressed, right? They never seem to be fixated on the future, right? It's like that. It's like that line in "Song of Myself," right, with Whitman, where he says, "I think I could go live with animals. They are so placid and self-contained." Right? They never, whine for forgiveness, right? They never prostrate, in worship of things and their own ancestors. And you sort of get this idea, reading Breakfast of Champions, how much people require and the lengths that they go to not only keep this wealth, but also if it's ever depleted, the psychological trauma that engenders, and the kind of requirements that you have to undertake if you ever wish to make it back, right? Because money is this thing where it's very much a self-replicating process. The more money that you have, it's far easier to make more and more and more of it. The less of it that you have, it's harder and harder and harder to make any of it at all. Right. That's just that's just, and that's, not only the logic of money, but it's logic of money specifically in relation to human beings, right? We require so much. We need so much in terms of comfort because we are in many ways just kind of like very ingenious, right? And if there is like something out there that could give you what you really want the most, and for the average person, it's just like endless consumption. If there is some magical thing that could give you this endless consumption, and money is that thing, right? There's going to be so many systems put in place, so many fail safes put in place, so that when people do have access to that thing called money, it's just going to start to multiply and multiply and multiply, right?
Yeah. Well, and right, and one of the other hallmarks of Vonnegut's satire is, you're right in the sense of like human beings require so much upkeep and all these different aspects of ourselves that we have to cater to, but we also choose to accentuate so much of that beyond what's actually required, right? So, Vonnegut's really good at pillorying this endless consumption and the more is more mentality that he sees in not just America, mainly America, but globally and among humans, period. And one of the things that hits hardest for me whenever I read his novels is there will always be some sort of, whether major or minor character, often both, something that they want that is so desperately banal, but he makes them want it so badly, right? So like in this book, one that stood out to me is Bonnie McMahon, the cocktail waitress who just so desperately wants nothing more than some steel radial front tires for her car, right? And like she's, her husband, who seems to be kind of a drunkard and a ne'er-do-well, he tries to start what was it, not a car dealership, like a car wash, maybe.
Oh yeah, car wash. Yeah, something like that.
Yeah, he tries to take some of their money and start a car wash, and he fails. And he's basically at home just like constantly getting drunk and watching baseball or whatever. And she's out there hustling, smiling, right? That's the, Vonnegut says she knew that's the one thing you had to do all the time to get better tips. And she really just wants some radial tires for her car, right? So anyway, it's just that it always makes me chuckle when I read those kind of wants, because it's like, well, we don't really get maybe enough of a picture into her character to know why that would be the thing, but it's kind of good that he leaves that so ambiguous.
That's a good part. Yeah.
Why? Why would she want that more than so many other options, almost infinite options of other things she could want.
And I feel like one of the reasons why the novel works is you could answer that question right now, right, without any deeper insight into her character. Mm-hmm. The reason why she wants radial tires is the exact same reason why someone else might want aluminum siding for their house.
Yeah,
because that's the other
or
joke.
Permastone.
Yeah. What was it? Like the line was something like, we could look it up later. In your experience, when people get aluminum siding, do they like it?
Yeah.
Or like, are they happy?
Are they happy?
Are they happy with it? Right? Why would someone want that as opposed to this, as opposed to that? You could just switch out the human being, right? If it's not, a waitress with a specific kind of tire, it's going to be someone else with, I want, the front of my house to look different, or I want the side to look different, or, I want this, I want that, right? And there's this other line in this novel where this is kind of encapsulated by babies coming into this world, right? When at a time when, like in the 70s when it was written, there were all these fears about a population explosion, population boom that would lead to a complete kind of, like the whole kind of, Malthus thing, right? This a population explosion will lead to, wars and all sorts of other problems, renewed scarcity.
Famine, genocide, yeah.
Yeah, and there's this line that, babies coming into the world screaming for milk, right? And like, just think of that as an image, right? That's just so that's just so true of human beings. And I always say this, but when adults become adults, they really sort of forget what it's like not only to be a child, but they forget the kind of deeper metaphors of like, what it is, for example, to be a baby, right? Yeah. Just being born and automatically screaming for milk. That is just such a perfect kind of encapsulation of what human beings are, what the problems are of like being, a human being in a world where, I'm not one of these people that believes in scarcity in that kind of way, but it's true that we have, scarce resources, right? And whether or not there's going to be a way out of it, the fact is, like, we would have to, forge that way, right? We would have to invent things to make something out of scarcity, right? To make it infinite and not scarce, right? There has to be some sort of technocratic intervention. The real human condition is coming into the world, demanding things that are difficult to acquire.
Yeah. Yep. Well, and so that makes me want to talk about one of the other things I highlighted as a main theme in this book, and it's sprinkled throughout pretty much all of Vonnegut's work, but his complete skewering of corporate interests. And I really believe he does this better than any other writer. But maybe we don't want to get to that just yet. Is there other stuff you want to set up first before we get to that?
I mean, let's just give a brief outline, right? Because the way that this book is like structured, well, maybe you could give like a plot outline, right? It's just so kind of pastiche, right? And the plot almost doesn't matter, right? It's the little sketches and the observations and everything surrounding the plot that matters. So maybe if we get the plot out of the way, we could just go straight into these like individual passages and read them and talk about the commentary.
Yeah, sounds good. Let's do that. So the real quick primer on the plot itself is that Kilgore Trout, who's a recurring character in the Vonnegut universe, is invited to attend the Midland City, Indiana Arts Festival. And he's invited by Elliot Rosewater, who's another recurring character, who's wealthy and influential, and maybe, as far as we know, is Trout's only real fan. Trout has written really, really, what's the word I'm looking for? He writes a lot, right? Yeah. He's prolific. And so, but all of his stuff gets published basically in pornographic magazines and material. And so he's sort of doomed to this, backroom writer that no one knows about, presumably.
And the reason why that's done, it's not even that people read it. It's just filler pages, right? Right. To make, I guess, like the dirty images seem less dirty on the outside or something.
Right, which again is even a bit of a lampooning of Playboy, right? That does these interviews and has articles or short stories published in the magazine, right? So it's kind of a play on that. But Anyway, so Trout is invited to receive an award and to speak at this arts festival. He's doesn't want to go at first, but eventually decides to go. But right out of the gate, it's set up to where he is going to end up colliding with Dwayne Hoover, who's a fairly prominent like business person in Midland City. He owns the most successful car dealership. He's got a number of other business interests that come to light as the novel moves on. And Dwayne is slowly going insane is kind of the way that this is set up, and it's due to the bad chemicals, quote unquote, in his brain. But he needs bad ideas to combine with the bad chemicals to really go insane. Which, I mean, I think there's going to be a lot of little moments like this where we talk about ways that Vonnegut was prescient, and what he predicted, but that it seems to me to be yet another way in which he was like able to kind of highlight some of the things that would really come to the fore in the internet age, right? Where people who are maybe already mentally ill can get easier access to horrendous ideas, and that causes them to act out in the real world in ways that can have dire consequences. But anyway, the two of them are kind of on this collision course. And so they're both, Trout is traveling to Midland City. Hoover already lives there. So there's a lot of scenes that revolve around his interactions with other characters. And gradually we build and build and build. Trout makes his way to Midland City. He arrives. The whole, climax of the book takes place at the Holiday Inn in the cocktail lounge, which I think Dwayne Hoover also has a business interest in. And his homosexual son, Bunny, is kind of the main longtime performer there. He sort of tinkles away playing the white man's blues at the Steinway Baby Grand piano in that lounge. And so eventually, too, Vonnegut, as the narrator or author of the book, injects himself as a physical character into that scene, right? He's present from fairly early on in the book, where he says what he thinks about certain things. He uses I and kind of talks about it and enters, but they're in that scene in the cocktail lounge. He actually arrives. And so there's plenty of other little things that happen in these snippets. Dwayne Hoover's wife had killed herself by eating Drano years ago, and he's never gotten over that. Francine Pefko, his office secretary, is his lover. So there's some scenes with them, and Francine becomes, not a major, but maybe more than a minor character in certain ways. There's Wayne Hubler, who's, been released from prison and kind of loiters around Dwayne Hoover's car lot and is black. And so, there's a number of different ways that race relations in America get addressed in the book. That's one of the main ones. And then really everything just goes completely off the rails at that cocktail lounge once Dwayne Hoover gets a hold of some writing by Kilgore Trout, and Hoover goes on a rampage. He hurts a lot of people, including Trout, and so on, maybe, as Vonnegut would say, right? So that kind of is the loose sketch of the actual plot of the book.
Yeah, well, just to comment on just a couple of things. We could get to Trout later. I mean, he's a recurring Vonnegut character, and he's pretty interesting throughout his kind of literary output. But he's also, I think, probably most interesting in this book. I think he plays the biggest role in this book compared to any of his other books.
He does, yeah.
But so one thing that you said before we get to Trout was Kurt Vonnegut puts himself like as a narrator into the book, and at the ending, right, where he appears. Do you think that this is, really like Kurt Vonnegut? Do you think this is throughout the text an unreliable narrator in general? I mean, the preface to the book, right? It's a few pages long, and the end is written as so the sign off here is
Philboyd Studge.
Yeah, Philboyd Studge, right? So Vonnegut specifically does not wish to use his name here. My guess is usually when authors do that, I know when I write books and I have again, novel that I'm working on now, there's going to be also an introduction, not under my name, but clearly there's supposed to be some sort of stand-in for me, right? But authors that perhaps want to make the point that don't read this as directly who I am, right? Directly my opinions. Has some of my opinions, some of my preoccupations, but it's not really me. So I guess the first question is, how close should we think, the readers, that this is this is Kurt Vonnegut, right, as the narrator? And the second part is, I just found Philboyd Studge. Let's say that this is the true narrator's name. I just found him to be a pretty unreliable. Maybe not in ways that are just directly obvious, but there's definitely plenty of hints throughout that you can't truly take his commentary or even his interpretation of events as presented in the novel as truly as how things are, right? Whether it's like plot level events or whether there's something a little bit deeper. So maybe if you have any commentary on just the narration, who the narrator is, and reliable, unreliable, do you think that's the proper route to go, or what?
Yeah, I think you're right. He's an unreliable narrator, and there's even times where he hints that he is going insane himself, or he used to be mentally ill, and then he says, "But I'm better now."
And specifically, he says that he's schizophrenic, right?
He's schizophrenic, right? He likes the word schizophrenia, and he kind of breaks it down, and he talks about that pertaining to himself. So, but then he tries to assure you that he's done some soul searching or gone to therapy, and he's better now. But it is hard to believe that, based on especially what happens. I mean, by the time that he enters physically in the cocktail lounge, you get the sense that you're dealing with a kind of a zany character, right? He puts the light out at his table. He's wearing basically, the darkest sunglasses he can find that function as mirrors or leaks, as Vonnegut likes to call them. And he, I mean, this made me laugh out loud. There's this line where I think Bonnie McMahon comes around and asks him if he wants anything, and if he can even see anything. She's like, "There's no light over here, and you've got sunglasses on. How can you see anything?" And I think he just says, the big show is all inside my head. The big show is all going on inside there, and it's really kind of a humorous moment. So yeah, you definitely get the sense that he has kind of gone crazy, and it maybe in some way is both deriving a bit of warped pleasure from reporting everything that's going on in Midland City, because it maybe makes him feel better about his own state, or that it's just something that needs to be addressed and reported, and he's just the one who happens to be able to do it and is present at the time to see it. So definitely plenty of hints that he's an unreliable narrator. And I didn't take it as literally, Vonnegut himself trying to portray himself. Maybe there's elements of that, but it's an unreliable narrator. And so in that sense, he really does become just kind of another wacky character in the novel. Yeah.
Actually, in the epilogue, I mean, there's an interesting kind of, I mean, we'll talk about it more in depth later, but there's an interesting kind of thing that happens where you see that the narrator, so he presents himself as a writer, right? He says that, I'm the writer of this novel. I can do whatever I want with you, Kilgore Trout, because I've written you. I can anticipate your behavior. Right? I could anticipate what would happen elsewhere because, I am the author. Similar to some of the stuff that Dan does, right? In his, whether it's the Camelot Quintet, you have, I forget if it's the Danny Wagner characters, if that's his stand in there, or somebody else, but in Camelot Quintet, there's this kind of over voice, right? That sometimes comes out directly or is implicit elsewhere. Right. So it's a similar thing going on here, but with Dan's Camelot Quintet, there's a more kind of didactic element. Here it's more obscure, right? There's less of an obvious kind of reason why it's happening. I think perhaps even it's not even maybe fleshed out enough. Right. I was telling Dan, like, don't you think that this Danny Wagner intervention is a little too didactic? But in this case, it's kind of like, well, it probably works better, I think, than some of the kind of less, developed portions of here. Because, like I guess losing didactism might be, I don't want to say it's necessarily a benefit, right? Because it's not, that's kind of like also like an aesthetic judgment. It's not either a pro or a con, but there's other stuff that you could do with it once you lose a didactic edge, right? There's, I think, other possibilities that open up perhaps even more richly than pure didactism. But at any rate, there's a passage there that shows that there is an actual limit to his powers as the author, right? Yeah. Which again is one of the reasons why he does come off as pretty unreliable. So when he's like confronting Trout, right, as the author, on page 298, he says, "I thought it would be a good idea to let him have a good look at me, and so attempted to flick on the dome light. I turned on the windshield washers instead. I turned them off again. My view of the lights of the county hospital was garbled by beads of water. I pulled out another switch, and it came away in my hand. It was a cigarette lighter. So I had no choice but to continue to speak from darkness." And if you can imagine this, like if this is done like as a play or whatever, or as a movie, it would be pretty humorous, right?
Yeah.
He's trying to show his power, right? How he can control anything. He is commanding essentially these lights to turn on, and nothing happens, right? Cigarette light comes out. It's almost like a joke, right? It's almost like it's almost kind of like a slapstick in a way. But it does speak to genuine limits to his powers. And they sort of, they do come on in a little bit of schizophrenic fashion, right? Where on the one hand, sometimes he has powers. On the other hand, like, perhaps his imagination or his fears get the best of him, and he's not able to do that. So it's just an interesting like set of asides, right? It's not totally clear, right? And in any kind of obvious, overt, especially not in a ham-fisted way, what the function of all this is.
Yeah, right. And I mean, I definitely laughed at that section you just highlighted. One other one that hints at that same thing was on page 207, where he's talking again about the way that he's giving different characters different attributes or backstories. And he says, "And he went on staring at me, even though I wanted him to stop now." This is him again speaking as the author. So presumably he could make him do that, but he can't. "I wanted him to stop. Now, here was the thing about my control over the characters I created. I could only guide their movements approximately, since they were such big animals. There was inertia to overcome. It wasn't as though I was connected to them by steel wires. It was more as though I was connected to them by stale rubber bands. So I made the green telephone in back of the bar ring, and then it goes on with the rest of the scene. But so I think that section to me served two purposes. Number one is to continue to drive home the unreliability of the narrator, and obviously it injects some humor. But I do think in a way it's also Vonnegut, who was kind of notoriously honest about how difficult it was for him to write, right? He's got that quote about, "When I write, it's as though I'm an armless, legless child with a crayon in its mouth," or something like that. And so I think this is him talking in a way about the difficulty of writing, and like I'm not some grand puppet master all the time, where I just can absolutely make things happen. It feels to me like I'm connected to my characters by stale rubber bands, which is such a Vonnegutian image in a way. So therefore, they might be liable to snap at any time. Maybe I'll lose control over the characters and the arc of this novel and everything else. So he kind of it's two functions there, maybe with that idea.
I mean, it's also true though that just to reread and emphasize these lines, like this is a good description of also how art is, right, and how writing is, and perhaps even how it ought to be. There was inertia to overcome. It wasn't as though I was connected to them by steel wires, right? And if you think of like a steel wire, you could think of a little bit of perhaps Like, is steel a good conductor of electricity? It should be, right?
I think so. I think it can conduct electricity. Yeah.
Because I know, like, I used to like play with this a little bit, right? There's, different metals are better and worse conductors, right? And you could feel it if you, for example, connect your hand or whatever. I think copper is supposed to be far more connective than steel, for instance. But anyway,
Copper and tungsten, yeah, yeah.
like if you think like in the modern world, right? Steel, like steel wires, right? If you're connected by electricity, they're supposed to be this kind of like instantaneous kind of connection. They're supposed to be an instantaneous action. But in reality, when you're writing, it was more as though it's connected to them by stale rubber bands, right? Because if you are in fact creating genuine human-like characters, they are supposed to have their own minds in a sense, aren't they? Right? They are supposed to be able to behave in ways that are unexpected. I mean, like sometimes when I'm writing things, or like I'm plotting something out, right? Like if it's going to be like a novel or whatever, all kinds of surprising things come into my head, because you always want to think of this from the perspective of, well, what would this character do in this kind of situation? It's not exactly how I would act, right? It's not necessarily even what I want them to do, but if this makes sense and this is where they're going, you have to allow things to flourish specifically in that direction, right? Because one of the things about writing well is you have to trust yourself enough that you are willing to give up control, in the sense of, well, I wanted this novel to feel like this, look like this, sound like this, be like this. And if you're writing, and through the course of writing, it tends to take on a different kind of life, you have to trust yourself enough, and you have to not be scared, enough to, just allow that to happen in that direction.
Yeah. Yeah, that's a good point. So I think that's a pretty good summation of the narrator's character and what his function in the book. So do you want to start jumping into some of the direct passages that we highlighted?
I mean, there's a bunch of stuff even starting at chapter 1, right, where he sort of gives you so if you could think of the preface as the kind of metafiction, right, the kind of like the meta structure as well, like what exactly are we going to be dealing with in the meta sense. Chapter 1 kind of spells out many of the social preoccupations. I'm not sure, like, if you had anything highlighted there, maybe we could just take it from there.
Let me see. Hold on. Chapter 1. I think our page numbers are the same, even though we have two different editions of the book. So, I mean, in chapter 1, one of the things that stands out immediately, to me at least, I think I highlighted in my notes to you on page 13, where he does kind of immediately set up this whole idea of like the difficulty of life on Earth. That they're right at the top. Meanwhile, more babies were arriving all the time, kicking and screaming, yelling for milk. In some places, people would actually try to eat mud or such on gravel, while babies were being born just a few feet away, and so on. Dwayne Hoover's and Kilgore Trout's country, where there was still plenty of everything, was opposed to communism. It didn't think that Earthlings who had a lot should share it with others unless they really wanted to, and most of them didn't want to, so they didn't have to. And then he sort of carries on, from there, talking about American society and economic attitudes. So, that sets up right away a kind of a classic Vonnegut construct, right? He's going to be critical of society at large. He's going to be critical of America and the way that you approach things. The lack of compassion in society, that was a big one to him. And it comes through in pretty much all of his novels, but certainly this one. And he goes on to talk about the juxtaposition between Dwayne Hoover and Kilgore Trout, where Dwayne Hoover's fabulously well-to-do, Kilgore Trout doesn't have doodly squat. And it's, I don't know if you'd agree with me on this, because I don't think it's totally obvious the way that he sets up the characters that he thinks Kilgore Trout is a a better person or a more worthwhile person than Dwayne Hoover. I think you could argue that slightly it's set up that way, but just because Trout is an artist and doesn't seem so preoccupied with material things and building wealth, it doesn't. I mean, he's partly responsible for Dwayne Hoover's insane episode at the end, and
Yeah.
it's clear that Vonnegut is a little bit wary about what art's function is and what it can do and what it should do. But it's obvious as well. I mean, Dwayne Hoover's pretty much an awful person throughout. Even before he goes insane, it's just obvious that he's sort of a classic upper middle class American, entrepreneur light type character that Vonnegut wants to skewer a bit, and that comes through the rest of the novel. So
to respond to that question, I think it's an interesting kind of tension that exists in the book, because throughout the narrator, right, is making comments all the time about the power of art and the power of bad ideas, right? That Kilgore Trout is responsible for a number of these bad ideas, and the bad idea that is being isolated here is it's the nature of free will, right? Kilgore Trout writes a novel where the protagonist finds out, or at least has the assumption that he's the only kind of sentient being, right? He's the only one with free will. He's the only actual human, and everybody else is essentially a kind of robot. And that also plays off of this broader idea in the book, right? The controlling metaphor, I would say, it has to do, with this kind of like free will question, right? Where he believes that everyone is more or less a kind of machine, right? Even when the narrator is talking about writing, right, and he's like, I'm connected by stale rubber bands as opposed to steel wires. I mean, that kind of imagery, right, also speaks to this idea of there's something going on internally, right, that is not our free will, right? It just sort of happens. And but I'm not so sure that going back to the idea of the narrator being unreliable, it doesn't seem to me that Kilgore Trout necessarily is a writer full of bad ideas. I mean, some of the stuff like in this book and in other books, so when Kurt Vonnegut brings up Trout's name in the books that he writes, some of these books are just sound very ridiculous, right? They don't seem like they're good concepts for novels. But other times, at the very least, you have an intriguing idea, or at least the way that Vonnegut phrases the idea, it's intriguing. Perhaps it's more so that whenever like a novel idea is brought up from Trout in the context of this novel, where it is and how Vonnegut describes it, maybe like the strength of the idea comes from Vonnegut himself. But if Trout, it's true that Trout is blamed by the narrator in this book, and meaning not necessarily Vonnegut himself, but the narrator in this book. He's blamed for the fact that Dwayne Hoover goes insane, but it strikes me as like Trout would be, stochastically responsible, like not truly responsible. In the same way that if I write an essay or I do a video, like, oh, look at this piece of shit, poet, right? And then somebody's watching that. It's like, yeah. And it goes off on a fucking rampage and, kills, this poet simply because they watched my video. Am I responsible? I'm stochastically responsible, but, that's not, so it's like the same thing here, right? So it like, basically I would say the way that Trout is characterized by the narrator, that part also seems kind of unreliable to me. And it does add textures to the novel, does add layers, right? It does add a richness to it.
Yeah.
It's just that I feel like, to the extent that this is a better book than that Cat's Cradle is a better book, all those parts in Cat's Cradle seem to work in concert for any number of conclusions, any number of positions that the narrator takes, and that the author Vonnegut takes. Here, I'm not like I just said a lot that I think is true about Trout and how it's unreliable to blame him that, he's only stochastically responsible, blah, blah, blah. But it doesn't seem to necessarily sum together in any grand overarching, vision. You know what I mean?
Yeah, I do. I know what you mean. And I think that with Trout's character, and this comes back around with Rabo Karabekian and Beatrice Kienzler, right? The two other artists that end up appearing. And maybe you can argue in a small way that Bunny Hoover is a bit of an artist, playing the cocktail lounge piano. That Vonnegut seems he's not making any of the artists out to be any kind of hero. It's like they have their ideas and they push their ideas out on the public, and whatever happens. I think with Trout's character, he one thing that the narrator does a good job of, that again is fairly true about artists and the way they work, is things happen in Trout's life and he's always got the antenna up. So something will happen, someone will say something, he'll be in a situation, and it gives him an idea for a short story or a novel. And the narrator will usually say, at some point, Trout decided to write a short story based on that. And I think the main one maybe that we'll want to talk about is the sounds of words idea. And I think that actually has some further import. But he's just setting Trout up as someone who creates because he feels compelled to create, and he's kind of responding to the world around him. Whether or not he creates great art out of that or his ideas are all good, he makes it pretty clear they're not all good. And then with Karabekian and Kienzler, he just outright says he thinks their stuff is shit. And there's a really funny scene, later on in the book where Rabo Karabekian stands up and defends the temptation of St. Anthony abstract painting, and that everyone's upset that he got paid so much money for, which again is one of the funniest scenes in the whole book to me, because even he, as the narrator and the author and controller of Karabekian, is like blown away by the last stand that he makes, and how the force of his rhetoric, which is just sort of humorous, right? But yeah, he's certainly just kind of setting Trout up as a prolific but shambling, person and author, someone maybe at the very end of their life, the end of their powers, but still kind of persisting, still coming up with stuff to write about.
Yeah.
So,
yeah. And also just before we move on from chapter 1, right, because this is how it started. I mean, there's a lot of like funny stuff there, right? So when the political commentary starts, it's like this: listen, Trout and Hoover were citizens of the United States of America. This is page 7, by the way. A country which was called America for short. This was their national anthem, which was pure balderdash, just like so much they were expected to take seriously. Then we get the national anthem, which of course has like so many question marks. And it's summed up like this: there were 1 quadrillion nations in the universe, but the nation Dwayne Hoover and Kilgore Trout belonged to was the only one with a national anthem, which was gibberish sprinkled with question marks. And like, I've honestly never really thought too much about the national anthem, but when I first read this book, I realized, you know what? Our national anthem really fucking sucks. Like, it just sucks. Like, it just sucks in so many respects, like as poetry, as like whatever. And also it's like, what are you even like, saying really? Like later on, like, so some of the illustrations, right, we have the famous thing on the dollar, right? We have the pyramid with the eye, and that's summed up as if they studied their paper money for clues as to what their country was all about, they found, among a lot of other Baroque trash, a picture of a truncated pyramid with a radiant eye on top of it, like this. Not even the president of the United States knew what that was all about. It was as though the country were saying to its citizens, "In nonsense is strength." And, whether you're talking about the US or any country, like it is kind of true, isn't it? Like this, the sort of like nonsense tribalism of a nation state, right? Or a nonsense tribalism that exists in any other kind of access. Like it is nonsense. It is gibberish, right? But it is the gibberish that gels people together. I mean, I feel like, especially now, since It's usually like very kind of educated people that can step outside of themselves and can even transcend national borders to some degree. Are, you know, when they tend to discuss these things, they tend to really underrate how powerful the force of nationalism is.
Yeah.
Right. They really misunderstand the fact that most people in the world, you know, do not share their assumptions about nation states and the future. When they think of like a country like China, they think it's, you know, it's communism ideology that really defines it. When, you know, if you know anything about that country, you know that nationalism defines China far more than anything else, right? And this is the thing, you know, that grants legitimacy to Xi Jinping. And you know, the odd thing about it is that, you know, you have people like Xi Jinping that get trashed, you know, rightfully, you know, by Americans, but also hypocritically, right? Because people like Xi have way more legitimacy in the eyes of his people than Biden or Trump or whoever has in the eyes of American citizens, right? And you know, nationalism as a force is both underrated, and it's good, right, that Vonnegut is not merely dismissing nationalism, you know, in typical liberal fashion as like, oh, you know, like fuck this, let's not think about it, it's not important. No, he tries to make it central to his critique of how human beings are, how the planet is, why the world is the way that it is, right? And you know, actually taking it seriously, even if he thinks it's ultimately a toxic sort of invention. He does take it seriously, and he does want to tease out the implications, like even if it's through jokes, right? He wants to understand nationalism in this way, right? And then I found this part also pretty funny, right? Where so
talks about
so it's like, but some of the nonsense was evil since it concealed great crimes. For example, teachers of the children in the United States of America wrote this date on blackboards again and again and asked the children to memorize it with pride and joy, right? 1492. The teachers told the children that this was when their continent was discovered by human beings. Actually, millions of human beings were already living full and imaginative lives on the continent in 1492. That was simply the year in which sea pirates began to cheat and rob and kill them, right? And it's funny because like even hyper-educated people like Steven Pinker, like that is not ever a part of his critique, right? When he writes a book like Enlightenment Now, he does not square in any way the fact that there was like a 90 percent plus depopulation by genocide, which builds all the institutions that he so comes to love, right? He's not willing to deal with that reality. Here was another piece of evil nonsense which children were taught, that the sea pirates eventually created a government which became a beacon of freedom to human beings everywhere else. There were pictures and statues of this supposed imaginary beacon for children to see. It was sort of an ice cream cone on fire. It looked like this, right? And it's funny because like on the one hand, it's like, you know, you have like almost like a childlike image, right? This is something that kids could sort of understand, right? If it's like an ice cream cone. On the other hand, right, he takes like, which is like, it's like a little bit, you know, I don't want to call it banal, but you know, some of the description here, like some of this political commentary, it's a little bit prosaic, but he tries to make it hinge on the image of an ice cream cone on fire, right? Which is going to be the thing that gives like any sort of like poetic heft, right? When he describes how silly this all is, but by putting it on fire, it's not merely silly now, it's also, you know, there's this kind of edge to it. There's this kind of, you know, there's this danger to it, right?
Yeah.
So,
well, and a couple of thoughts in response to that. I'll work backwards. So the first is, I mean, on almost any page of this book or many of Vonnegut's novels, you could find this, but the examples you just read through do it pretty well. I think one of the hallmarks of his style is this prosaic description. He's very adept at making you rethink reality and the life that you have and the way that you live it by describing things exactly as they are with a slight twist, right? So, you know, it's like when you read the way that, and I'm sure we'll come across it in some other quotes we pull out, like the way that he'll describe something is just, it's like to me, it's always felt a little bit devastating in a way, because I'm like, damn, I mean, that thing is that banal. It is what he just described, you know?
Yeah.
And when you really think about it, that's so unimpressive. Yet, you know, it's the rallying cry or the rallying attitude or the rallying symbol for millions, if not billions of people on planet Earth. Like, they think that thing is so important. And he just completely skewered it with like 3 lines of prose, you know? So he does that well here. He does that well, period. Just as a writer, it's one of his main devices that he uses. But then I think the other thing that maybe is important to talk about in a sense with his style is, like, you know, he's an American writer. He obviously developed, you know, something of a more global perspective by being a soldier in World War II and these other things. But one of the important things, I think, with making a great work of art is its universal application, the way that it can expand out from the smaller universe that it creates and that it lives in. And he's coming at American society from so many different angles in this book and satirizing it. But the important thing would be that the way that he does that, you could do that with any nation, right? So, like, to me, America has its own you know, unique stuff that he takes on, but he could have been Chinese, and he could just decide to pick out the things about China as a nation and as a government that he wants to satirize, and he could take the same approach, and it would probably sound just as ridiculous in a lot of ways, right? He could put a picture of the Chinese flag, and he could talk about the way that the Chinese people have arranged their government, or Italian people, or Australians. I mean, you know, you pick it, right? And so I think that even though, you know, you and I are Americans, so a lot of this resonates deeply, but I think one of the reasons that he's a well-loved writer around the world is because people can pick up on this stuff and be like, oh yeah, when I think about my country, yeah, that's pretty much how it is, I guess, you know?
Yeah.
So it works, you know. It's a really effective way to write humorously the way that he does, you know?
Yeah. And just outside of some of the purely political stuff, right? So I want to turn to page 21, right? So this is where Trout is, you know, they're describing Trout's kind of like a writing habits. Trout's employer and coworkers had no idea that he was a writer. No reputable publisher had ever heard of him, for that matter, even though he had written 117 novels and 2,000 short stories by the time he met Duane. The odd thing, like, is this is supposed to make him sound absurd, but Dan Schneider, you know, will have many more than 117 novels by the time that he's dead,
right?
And we'll have many more than 2,000 poems, or, you know, in this case, it's going to be short stories. Yeah. So he made carbon copies of nothing he wrote. He mailed off manuscripts without enclosing stamped, self-addressed envelopes for their safe return. Sometimes he didn't even include a return address. He got names and addresses of publishers from magazines devoted to the writing business, which he read avidly in the periodical rooms of public libraries. He thus got in touch with a firm called World Classics Library, which published hardcore pornography in Los Angeles, California. They use the stories, which usually didn't even have women in them, to give bulk to books and magazines of salacious pictures. They never told him where or when he might expect to find himself in print. Here's what they paid him, diddly squat. They didn't even send him complimentary copies of the books and magazines in which he appeared, so he had to search them out in pornography stores. And the titles he gave to his stories were often changed. Pan-Galactic Straw Boss, for instance, became Mouth Crazy, right? So, you know, he's essentially serving, you know, as this kind of like, you know, physical padding, this kind of like physical pulp. On the one hand, it's kind of like, you know, so we have this unreliable narrator. We know that he's the author. He fancies himself the author. He says that he has all this like limitless power. So he made this decision, right, to make him essentially be the bulk in pornography stores. And he's also blaming Trout for the novel where there is no free will. Duane Hoover reads this, decides that he's the only one with free will, just like in the novel, and goes nuts. And, you know, it made me think, like, is this supposed to be like an implicit critique of Kilgore Trout? Is this an implicit critique of the fact that there is something out there potentially like called World Classics Library, which will do nothing except publish, just simple, pure hardcore pornography? Again, like another texture, like another dimension, right? Because from one perspective, we know that Trout does have valuable ideas. We know that, even like the tombstone that he's given, right?
Yeah,
and the epitaph on it, he says specifically, right, that ideas have power, and it's not that he's this kind of like fountain for the bad. But anyway, like going beyond this, right, there's a transition from this to a description of like sexual politics, right? So away from like pure politics to this. I find this like one of the funniest parts. So this is like on bottom of page 21. Skagg hoped to force his country into making laws against excessively large families, but the legislatures and the courts declined to meet the problem head on. This is describing a book. They passed stern laws instead against the possession of by unmarried persons of chicken soup, and so on. The illustrations for this book were murky photographs of several white women giving blowjobs to the same black man who, for some reason, wore a Mexican sombrero. At the time he met Dwayne Hoover, Trout's most widely distributed book was Plague on Wheels. The publisher didn't change the title, but he obliterated most of it and all of Trout's name with a lurid banner which made this promise. It says, "Wide Open Beavers" inside. A wide open beaver was a photograph of a woman not wearing underpants and with her legs far apart so that the mouth of her vagina could be seen. The expression was first used by news photographers who often got to see up women's skirts at accidents and sporting events and from underneath fire escapes and so on. They needed a code word to yell to other newsmen and friendly policemen and firemen and so on to let them know what could be seen in case they wanted to see it. The word was this: beaver. A beaver was actually a large rodent. It loved water, so it built dams. It looked like this. The sort of beaver which excited news photographers so much looked like this. So this is the contrast between the two beavers.
Oh, yeah.
When Dwayne was a boy, this is where babies came from. When Dwayne was a boy, when Kilgore Trout was a boy, when I was a boy, and even when we became middle-aged men and older, it was the duty of the police and the courts to keep representations of such ordinary apertures from being examined and discussed by persons not engaged in the practice of medicine. It was somehow decided that wide open beavers, which were 10,000 times as common as real beavers, should be the most massively defended secret under law. So there was a madness about wide open beavers. There was also a madness about a soft, weak metal, an element which had somehow been declared the most desirable of all elements, which was gold. Right. So it's like, on the one hand, you have like the fact that biologically speaking, male, female in most species on the planet, they, sexual differentiation means that the female has to be more kind of like sexually invested, having fewer eggs, right, compared to like, endless sperm essentially for males. And because of this kind of like biological fact that happened, a long, long time ago before human beings ever came on the planet, just biologically speaking, like there is this kind of, gold-like quality, right, to women, to vaginas, to all this, and gold, right, by being shiny and rare, right, a different kind of scarcity, also became very valuable, right, in this kind of system. And, Vonnegut is just kind of, making fun of the fact that if we are, to use the logic of the book, just like machines that are controlled by biology, the determinism of like billions of years ago, the determinism of the first motions of molecules at the start of the universe, we could see this play out in the most tragic of ways, right? Whether it's, the existence of rape, right, with like men, attempting to when they have not earned, a wide open beaver, taking it by force, or gold, not having earned it, not having owned it, taking it by force simply because they have a madness to it. So we have this like very interesting connection, right? Where, he's kind of like making this transition from this kind of, funny commentary on, male female relations to, like what is gold, right? And what has it done, right, to human beings, to societies? What role has it played in so many genocides on the planet, right?
Yeah.
So
yeah, it's a good leap and good connection that he makes there, and he goes on further for a little while with all that kind of stuff and women's underpants and these kind of things. But yeah, I mean, this whole section, is a lot, again, of that just like super straightforward prosaic description of things that makes you realize its absurdity, right? So
and just one more quick comment, right? So and this is how he sort of like, because Vonnegut has when I was talking to this actually didn't come up in our conversation, but Ethan Pinch and Dan Linden had a talk on Ethan's YouTube channel. I think it was titled Leviathan. And they were just for a few hours just discussing aesthetics, just like we did a few nights ago. And in that discussion, one of the things that I disagreed with was when Ethan and Dan Linden just kind of they were characterizing Vonnegut as an anti-humanist writer because he seems to be like very pessimistic about human beings, or I'm not so sure though if I would go that far, because what Vonnegut is describing is just absolutely true, right? I mean, it's just an accurate description of what human beings are like. The fact that they're subject to all kinds of like various lusts, the fact that they could go crazy, everything from like wide open beavers to gold, the fact that these could be such controlling elements in anyone's life. But, I don't necessarily get the sense from Vonnegut that this is anti-humanist, right? It's not that Vonnegut necessarily seems to believe that the world is going to end in annihilation, right? Which is what an anti-humanist might believe. Nietzsche would call himself, he would never say that he's an anti-humanist. He would say, no, in fact, I am a total humanist. I totally believe in the human project, which is why I've organized my morality in the way that I did. And I think, Vonnegut would say the same, not so much about his, maybe morality, but I mean, just look at the way like this section ends about the wide open beavers and the gold. After like some more digression on this part, he says, actually, women's underpants had been drastically devalued by the time of the historic meeting between Duane, Hoover, and Trout. The price of gold was still on the rise, right? And this taking place in the 70s, right? The hyperinflation fears, like gold was reaching all time highs there, right? This must have been in the news, and it's kind of like, well, we've introduced, rape. We've introduced so many other negatives like that are, afflicting women the world over, right? And depending on which parts of the world that you look at, these afflictions are far, far worse. But gold, right? This precious substance is still kind of loved, right? So essentially, women's underpants and women's sexuality and everything has been valued by, essentially, the price of gold, right? Set against gold when you think of things like prostitution, right? This strikes me less as pessimism and more of a kind of call to action, right? I very much feel like reading so many of his books, like there is this call to action, like when you read Cat's Cradle and you see what atomic weaponry or other kinds of mutually assured destruction can do, like Ice Nine. You very much think of it as a call to action, right? You think of the kind of craziness, right? The total insanity of having these kinds of weapons, and get the same sense in this book as well.
Yeah, I would tend to agree with you there, because I've always read Vonnegut as a saddened humanist. I guess, right? He's lamenting what we've created in large part, and yet you get the sense that underneath it all, he's pointing out our flaws. He's pointing out the forces that we've either created or that we continue to succumb to, that work against what I think, in his opinion, should be our actual interests and our true self-interest.
Mm-hmm.
And he's disappointed by all of that, but he still is kind of like rooting for us, in a way to figure out how to overcome these things.
Mm-hmm.
I think he also does a good job. I mentioned this earlier in the video, of even though this is it's got political elements, it's not totally a political book, but for what it is, he does a good job of pointing out some of the true causes of some of these problems, right? And I talked about his the way he highlights corporate interests and corporate hypocrisy. Mm-hmm. And I think it seems to me that in his mind, maybe there's still that feeling that, like, as an individual person, like, he still has this faith or this belief that individual humans and then humans collectively can do good. But when we organize ourselves into these in groups and out groups and power structures and what we allow to have power, that's when we start to really come up short and fail, and mm-hmm. just get particularly greedy, gain some kind of madness for money or power or whatever it might be. And there's so many different like companies and corporate things he sprinkles throughout this book. So you've got like General Mills, right? He talks about, like, the title of the book itself was lifted from General Mills mm-hmm. Corporation, but it's not it's not meant to disparage them or their fine products. Mm-hmm. He talks about Hertz makes an appearance in here. Ajax makes an appearance in here. He talks about Barytron, which mm-hmm. is like the war chemicals and the War Machine Company, but then they become just appalled to find out that they might be polluting Sugar Creek because mm-hmm. they outsourced the runoff job to the Maritimo brothers and the mob, who mm-hmm. acted like it was a good job, but they really just had all the waste flow straight into the creek, and how they were just they had always tried to be purveyors of good corporate responsibility mm-hmm. and always prided themselves on that, no matter what the cost. And so there's just all these ways that he's like, showing you, if you've got any kind of sense whatsoever, it's like, so you realize that, like, there are a lot of real corporations. This is mm-hmm. exactly how they behave, right? And they just kind of pointing that out in a humorous way. But so anyway, I mean, I think we've probably covered that pretty well. If we want to trudge on with some other
do you have
quotes.
Anything before chapter 8? Because after this, I'm just tackling chapter 8.
No, I'm good to jump ahead to chapter 8. That's probably where my next highlighted section comes from, or chapter 9-ish. Yeah.
So this is 76 through 78. So Kilgore Trout suddenly gets this money from what is it, Elliot Rosewater, right? Elliot Rosewater is the one that sends him this money, because he's this a big fan. Oh, I also read God Bless You, Doctor, not Doctor, Mr. Rosewater.
Yeah.
And the character obviously figures much more prominently in that novel, but he's this rich inhabitant of Midland County, and he's like the biggest and perhaps only fan of Kilgore Trout's writing. And he finally tracks him down in this book, and he decides to send him all this money to come speak at this Midland County Arts Festival, right? Which is why he's on his way there. So on his way there, he had this money, in half of it rather in his pocket, the other half he puts into the bank. And he suddenly finds himself, like, knocked unconscious, right, and robbed. And this is how it's described. The next thing he knew, he was on his hands and knees on a Hannibal cord underneath the Queensboro Bridge at 59th Street, with the East River nearby. His trousers and underpants were around his ankles. His money was gone. His parcels were scattered around him: the tuxedo, the new shirt, the books. Blood seeped from one ear. The police caught him in the act of pulling up his trousers. They dazzled him with a spotlight as he leaned against the backboard of the handball court and fumbled foolishly with his belt and the buttons on his fly. The police supposed that they had caught him committing some public nuisance, had caught him working with an old man's limited palette of excrement and alcohol. He wasn't quite penniless. There was a $10 bill in the watch pocket of his pants. Then when he's asked about this, the pure evil in the white Oldsmobile, how this happened to him, the way that he answers it is, for all I know, they may not even have been earthlings, said Trout. For all I know, that car may have been occupied by an intelligent gas from Pluto. Trout said this so innocently, but his comment turned out to be the first germ in an epidemic of mind poisoning. Here's how the disease was spread. A reporter wrote a story for the New York Post the next day, and he led off with the quotation from Trout. The story appeared under this headline: Pluto bandits kidnap pair. Trout's name was given as Kilgore Trout, incidentally, address unknown. His age was given as 82. Other papers copied the story, rewrote it some. They all hung on to the joke about Pluto, spoke knowingly of the Pluto Gang, and reporters asked police for any new information on the Pluto Gang, so police went looking for information on the Pluto Gang. So New Yorkers, who had so many nameless terrors, were easily taught to fear something seemingly specific, the Pluto Gang. They bought new locks for their doors and gratings for their windows to keep out the Pluto Gang. They stopped going to theaters at night for fear of the Pluto Gang. Foreign newspapers spread the terror, ran articles on how persons thinking of visiting New York might keep to a certain few streets in Manhattan and stand a fair chance of avoiding the Pluto Gang. In one of New York City's many ghettos for dark-skinned people, a group of Puerto Rican boys gathered together in the basement of an abandoned building. They were small, but they were numerous and volatile. They wished to become frightening in order to defend themselves and their friends and families, something the police wouldn't do. They also wanted to drive the drug peddlers out of the neighborhood and to get enough publicity, which was very important, to catch the attention of the government so that the government could do a better job of picking up the garbage and so on. One of them, Jose Mendoza, was a fairly good painter, so he painted the emblem of their new gang on the backs of the members' jackets. This was it. That's the picture of the Pluto Gang. And I found this a very kind of telling and very, very kind of subtle commentary, right? It's supposed to be this like funny thing that happens to Trout, right? He gets beat up, and this media ecosystem runs away with his comet and turns it into the Pluto Gang. And you see two things happening though. You see on the one hand what the kind of like the white world is doing with this stuff, that they have less to fear with. And they're turning it almost into a personal adventure, right? Yeah. All these like places, even international, they have absolutely nothing to do in New York City, but are just trying to sell papers, or just trying to like sort of like be in the know, or trying to again like just play with a story that makes their lives more exciting. They turn it. They turn this into the Pluto Gang in the same way that right now, we have politics that have more or less evolved in the liberal side to, a bunch of people that are sitting around, that are well-to-do, that are educated, that can do whatever they want with their leisure time. So they decide to emotionally invest in politics with policies that have absolutely nothing to do with them, right? They could pretend that they could be into like the minimum wage, or they pretend like they're into like universal healthcare or whatever. And in fact, it doesn't matter to them because they have no actual material interest in many of these policies passing. On the other hand, you have an actual Pluto Gang that develops like, in a ghetto, right? Mm-hmm. And that's because, well, suddenly we have this thing in the ecosystem, in the media ecosystem, that is a point of fear. And you have a bunch of poor people that want to protect themselves, as is phrased, and their friends and families. And they're going to use that, right, to their advantage, right? To them, it's not a game, right? To them, they could use the gamified portion of this narrative to their advantage, but to them it's not a game. To them, and it also strikes me how true like the commentary is. Like before we even sort of understood why crime is higher or lower in some places, why the police is trusted versus not trusted. Vonnegut kind of like said it flat out, right? He was like, the police would not protect them. The people don't expect the police to do it, and because the police is not a force that is considered credible or trustworthy, you cannot go to the police with your problems, so you have to go to the gang with your problems, right? So like this thing that's supposed to be funny itself turns into this wider political comment, right? In a way that's just very easy to continue either viewing as a joke, as part of the joke when it's not, right? It's serious, or B, just like, implicitly miss it altogether and maybe, skim past this part.
Yeah. Yeah, that's all well said. And I mean, I didn't really key in on any of that when I was reading through it. So when I was looking over your notes, I saw your commentary on this, and rereading it again here. Yeah, you can definitely see that. It's also one more instance where Trout's ideas, just sort of germinate well beyond his intentions, right? I mean, he's a science fiction writer, so he's just kind of being cheeky maybe and saying, yeah, for all I know, it was an intelligent gas from Pluto. And then it's the way he knocks it into this mass hysteria in a way. And it's probably also a bit of a comment on just the media engine, right? And the way that they can kind of devise things and incite some kind of mind poison, the way that he talks about it. So it's, Trout can create mind poison on a small scale with one person for Dwayne Hoover, and he can do it on a large scale with the Pluto Gang.
Yeah. I mean, did you have anything else from that chapter, or like what else do you want to tackle? Because I got notes starting from chapter 12 again.
Yeah, I think let me just look to see. We can probably keep moving. Let me just see if I had anything else. Yeah, my next major thing is pages 86 and 87, which is in chapter 10. Yeah. So let me just point this out real quick. This was kind of an interesting thing. So this is, I guess we didn't say that the way Trout is getting to the arts festival is by hitchhiking, right? So he like doesn't have a car of his own. He maybe can't even afford the bus or the train, right? So he's like literally has that much difficulty. He truly has doodly squat. And so he's having these conversations along the way with the different people that pick him up. And so this is in page 86. It says he had at the top, the driver said he used to be a hunter and a fisherman long ago. It broke his heart when he imagined that what the marshes and meadows had been like only 100 years before. And when you think of the shit that most of these factories make, wash day products, cat food, pop, he had a point. The planet was being destroyed by manufacturing processes, and what was being manufactured was lousy by and large. Then, which we've talked about before, I think, is, does capitalism actually produce things of value, right? There's so much of little to no value that gets made just so people can make a buck. But anyway.
Well, cat food is definitely a value. I don't know why it's put in that category.
Yeah, cat food is important. Then Trout made a good point too. Well, he said, I used to be a conservationist. I used to weep and wail about people shooting bald eagles with automatic shotguns from helicopters and all that, but I gave it up. There's a river in Cleveland which is so polluted that it catches fire about once a year. That used to make me sick, but I laugh about it now. When some tanker accidentally dumps its load in the ocean and kills millions of birds and billions of fish, I say, more power to Standard Oil, or whoever it was that dumped it. Trout raised his arms in celebration. Up your ass with mobile gas, he said. The driver was upset by this. You're kidding, he said. I realized, said Trout, that God wasn't any conservationist, so for anybody else to be one was sacrilegious and a waste of time. You ever see one of his volcanoes or tornadoes or tidal waves? Anybody ever tell you about the ice ages he arranges for every 500,000 years? How about Dutch elm disease? There's a nice conservation measure for you. That's God, not man. Just about the time we got our rivers cleaned up, he'd probably have the whole galaxy go up like a celluloid collar. That's what the Star of Bethlehem was, What was the Star of Bethlehem, said the driver. a whole galaxy going up like a celluloid collar, said Trout. So it's just kind of interesting because once again, this is a way where it kind of goes on with this conversation, but Vonnegut is continuing to not cast Trout as some kind of, great person. Certainly like this set of ideals, if Trout is to be believed, this is actually how he approaches, the ideas of the environment and conservation now, is like not a liberal in any sense, right?
Mm-hmm.
More power to Standard Oil is what he's saying. But he does make, kind of this tongue-in-cheek point about like the nature of the universe and God, if he does exist, just like things are coming into being and then being viciously destroyed every nanosecond of every day around the galaxy. And so like, who am I to try to say what should and shouldn't be happening now?
Mm-hmm.
I think you and I would argue that clearly, there's a difference where we know better, right? So, we again, you're going to have some kind of corporation producing some good, and if they just have all these intense negative externalities, then whatever. I mean, that's a poor attitude to have. But just more interesting characterization of Trout, because when I read that, it was different than what I expected his stance to be, right?
Yeah.
And Vonnegut's not painting him in a great light, at least by like traditional, more left-wing values there.
Yeah.
So.
And I mean, in terms of like some of the tensions about like Trout's ideas and the narrator's opinions on him, I mean, this could be considered one of the bad ideas, right?
Mm-hmm.
That's alluded to, but it's also a little bit of a it's a little bit of a Howard Bloom take on the environment, right? Where you have people like Bloom that argue the vast majority of something like climate change or whatever else is coming along due to natural factors, right? I mean, it is true in terms of like when we look back in history, like dinosaur age or whatever. I mean, there were no the polar ice caps. Like there was no winter anywhere. It was just more or less a kind of like humid and endless summer, right? Simply because there was far more carbon dioxide in the atmosphere than there is now. And we have this kind of like this kind of like ebb and flow of carbon dioxide, among other things, within the environment that causes all sorts of changes in the planet. And it is true that you always have to sort of strike a balance between what you can do versus what is a natural process, right? So, but not to like whitewash this commentary though. So
skip ahead to your next highlighted passage.
So in chapter, so this is more kind of like the monetary commentary, right? So on chapter 12, page 108, there's like this idea of like privilege, earned, unearned, that kind of thing. The governor of New York, Nelson Rockefeller, shook Trout's hand in a co-host grocery store one time. Trout had no idea who he was. As a science fiction writer, he should have been flabbergasted to come so close to such a man. Rockefeller wasn't merely governor. Because of the peculiar laws in that part of the planet, Rockefeller was allowed to own vast areas of Earth's surface, and the petroleum and other valuable minerals underneath the surface as well. He owned or controlled more of the planet than many nations. This had been his destiny since infancy. He had been born into that cockamamie proprietorship. "How's it going, fella?" Governor Rockefeller asked him. "About the same," said Kilgore Trout. I mean, like, this is like, if you just think about the implications, right? Some of the stuff that is being spelled out, right? When people discuss like, state power versus corporate power, capitalism versus socialism. I mean, some of the very same kind of arguments that I would make in a more kind of long-winded essay-esque way, right? When I'm trying to argue with people about these points, this is kind of like said in a sentence, like, pose this question to yourself. Do you think that this is a sensible arrangement? He owned or controlled more of the planet than many nations. Should a private individual have more say about the world than a nation state, right? The nation state exists as a kind of, it's basically as a means of procuring the collective good, right? It's a way of dealing with the public commons, right? It's a way of providing what cannot be provided otherwise, or rather, even if you could make the argument that, well, technically, everybody could provide for themselves. Even if you want to make that argument, a nation state, by wielding and leveraging federated power, right? It can far more effectively wield power. It could far more effectively provide for the collective good, and to deal with the commons in a way that doesn't necessarily deplete it, depending on how it's organized, or B, uses it in a way that is actually useful and is more of an investment rather than a source of depletion, right? And just like these like little individual sentences, right, that kind of like spell out what all of this entails. I mean, like born into to essentially lord over this kind of territory, and for what, right? There's no evidence whatsoever that Rockefeller would be better at it than anybody else, right? This is not a meritocracy. And there's also no evidence that it's actually better, right, for the public good, that a private individual would be able to do this versus anybody else, right? And this is just like a simple little paragraph. And of course, there's that bit of dialogue, right? How's it going, fella? Right? This, it's almost kind of this condescension. About the same, right? Which is also like, like it's not like a phrase like about the same. Like, of course, he could just be talking about like, yeah, things are more or less the same for me as they've always been. But of course, like next to this paragraph, about the same also has this kind of like feeling, right? This like little texture of more or less how you're doing, right? Which is not, right? We know that it's not the case. So, and just well, go ahead.
It's also just a funny reply to that question, because I mean, I was getting from this that, they don't really know each other at all, right? So how would Rockefeller know what the same is for Kilgore Trout? It's just a funny thing for Trout to say. But yeah, I mean, again, similar to what we were talking about with the Pluto Gang, there again, just another real quick commentary on a big issue. And I think I said it in my notes to you about, I forget what exactly, maybe it's coming up, the reindeer problem with Harry LeSabre, and like the race relations, the way that Black people are talked about in this this town. But yeah, it's kind of classic Vonnegut, where he's it's just dense. He's what I said to you, punching heavy within a limited space, right? He's just able to kind of get a couple blows in a few sentences or a paragraph on a big topic that, again, just kind of as you as the reader, it's maybe a quick, like put the book down for a minute thing. And like, when it's framed up that way, this particular issue, like whether Vonnegut is trying to, convince you of his personal viewpoint or whatever, doesn't really matter. But it's like, no matter what, you realize that there's credibility to the position being stated through these characters. So and the next thing I had is getting onto this the sounds of words idea.
Well, actually, just under the passage that I read right back on 109, it's not political. It's just like I just thought it was funny, right? After insisting, so that like Trout is being, he's hitchhiking with this trucker. After insisting that Trout had a rich social life, the driver pretended, again for his own gratification, that Trout had begged to know what the sex life of a transcontinental truck driver was like. Trout had begged no such thing. You want to know how truck drivers make out with women, right? The driver said. You have this idea that every driver you see is fucking up a storm from coast to coast, right? Trout shrugged. Like, I like how Trout just like, has like no interest in this.
Yeah.
And then this is the way that this shrug is being described. The truck driver became embittered by Trout, scolded him for being so salaciously misinformed. Let me tell you, Kilgore, he hesitated. That's your name, right? Yes, said Trout. He had forgotten the driver's name 100 times. Every time Trout looked away from him, Trout forgot not only his name, but his face too. Kilgore, God damn it, the driver said. If I was to have my rig break down in co-host, for instance, and I was to have to stay there for 2 days while it was worked on, how easy you think it would be for me to get laid while I was there, a stranger looking the way I do? It would depend on how determined you were, said Trout. The driver sighed. Yeah, God, he said. He said, and he despaired for himself. That's probably the story of my life. Not enough determination. Right. So I mean, like on the one hand, like, you know, this driver is presented as a kind of like slightly pathetic figure. You know, on the other hand, like there's this kind of like knowing reality that you know, like most people on the one hand, they don't have enough determination. I mean, this is just kind of the nature of, again, going back to biology, going back to the kind of precepts in the book that we're all machines. You know, laziness developed as a kind of like, you know, a biological mechanism to conserve energy when it wasn't necessary to be used, right? I mean, in lots of societies, lots of like pre-industrial, prehistoric societies as well, you know, you could have like an average of like 4 to 6 hours a day of work, right? Which means that, you know, and at a time when you could very easily starve, doing more than 4 to 6 hours of work if you don't need to, that's not a very good, you know, trade-off. But then on the other hand, we know that most likely it's not even the issue of determination, right? That's at issue here, right? That's not really what we're talking about, because even if you can make that statement about most people on the planet, not enough determination, it's not determination that got Nelson Rockefeller, you know, from infancy, you know, control over more land than entire nation states have control over, right? That's not determination. In fact, when you think about the kind of work that a truck driver must do, which is away from family, away from comforts, constant getting fucking hemorrhoids from, like, you know, riding 12 hours a day. It's a dangerous job on top of it. Yeah. You know, you know, like, and, you know, like Vonnegut understands this, right? He understands the kind of problems with manual labor, right? So it's like, you know, it's this like self-deprecating humor that is also not totally accurate. And it's also not accurate because of this, like, you know, infinite regress, right? This causal chain where at the end of it, you have a guy that gets to be a truck driver while somebody else gets to be Nelson Rockefeller, while somebody else gets to be, like, you know, something in between, like a college professor or something, right? So it's both, like, it's like a critique of the driver. Like, you don't want to turn these people into heroes, right? Like, we're going to talk about Wayne Hubler later. Like, he's not you know, it's true that he's black. It's true that he's been exploited. It's true that he's meant to be a sympathetic character, but he's not presented in a way that's like, he's not especially interesting. He's not especially intelligent. He's not especially heroic. And I feel like for you know, artists, it's very easy when you're trying to make some sort of like social comment or political point. It's very easy to turn, you know, a character into like a representation for like that one thing. Whereas like this truck driver, he represents a few things. He's the contrast to Nelson Rockefeller, but he's also a contrast to himself. And and you also do get the sense that, you know, like determination is a part of it, but that's not really the point, right? But you're also not whitewashing determination either.
Right. Well, and the section you just read takes place in the broader context of a pretty long conversation that the truck driver and Trout have. And he asks him about aluminum siding. He asks him about permastone. He insists that Trout must have some kind of, you know, vibrant social life, being, you know, a salesperson in his community. And Trout's just like, nah, you know, I work alone, and it's it's not not really that big of a deal. But you know, and on, and then they kind of continue forward where this is what we talked about for a quick minute earlier. From what you've seen and heard, the people who get aluminum siding, are they happy with what they get? Around
Yeah.
co-host, said Trout, I think those were about the only really happy people I ever saw. And then it goes on and talk about,
what do you think that means though? That comment, right? Around co-hosts, I think those were the only really happy people I ever saw.
yeah, I mean, I kind of interpreted that as just a classic, like Vonnegut, like in a way, just a scathing, critique on this kind of person in modern America, right? Like that, and they're obviously not really happy, right?
Mm-hmm.
Like we know that, but Trout's perception that that was the one thing that maybe could give them like that sugar rush of consumptive happiness briefly, and those are the only type of people that he perceived to be happy in any kind of sense.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, so I mean that was my perception of it, and it kind of goes on. One quick thing I wanted to point out, and it's easy to see on these two pages, 110 and 111, but I find this interesting. I didn't know if you had any comments on it, like the way that these breaks are done, right, in the dialogue, but it's always a continuation of the same conversation right afterward. So to me, it almost reads a little bit like poetic enjambment,
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
that Vonnegut's employing here, because there's no reason for him to do this, right? I mean, it's just, it could, in most other books, it would be presented as just a continuous, normal paragraph by paragraph chain of conversation and description.
Yeah,
But he does these little
I agree.
ellipses
Yeah.
to break up the pages,
Yeah.
And kind of like force you into a little bit more of a pause than just a pyramid or even a paragraph break would do.
Yeah.
So like in the middle of page 111, this is all by itself. The truck driver told Trout about a gas hot water heater he had bought 30 years ago, and it hadn't given him a speck of trouble in all that time. I'll be damned, said Kilgore Trout. Right?
Yeah.
It's
Yeah.
like such a devastating little, banal piece of dialogue, and it's like, I don't know. I don't know what else to say about it other than like it's humorous, and it's also kind of sad, and just a little bit of like a brutal indictment on people, and like what they decide to talk about and what they think
Yeah.
is worthy of conversation. And Trout's obviously, pretty bored and really just probably wants to get to Midland City and be done with
Mm-hmm.
this hitchhiking, but he's a captive audience for this truck driver, So
Yeah. I mean, I think it's just a more subtle version of like, if you read Cat's Cradle, it's like something like
the chapter,
127 or like
yeah,
132 chapters, right? So with a book that's about 300 pages and you got, that many chapters, you essentially do have to have like a thing where like the chapters are these discrete units that are almost like, like lines of poetry, right? Where you have to have a very kind of, intentional reason for beginning and ending the chapter the certain way, the ways that they connect, right? You get a kind of like precise moment sometimes. And like in terms of like it being part of the same conversation, this kind of, this ellipsis here, like this, just like a little bit here, it you could have like a lull in conversation, right? Maybe an hour passes where they don't speak, right? Maybe 20 minutes pass, or maybe something else. But the point is, like, whatever happens, like any one of those outcomes, like might in fact be the case. We don't have to know, but we do know that by putting in the ellipses, like it is kind of like that enjambment, right? Where you have to sort of pay attention, right? Like, well, why does the line end here? Why does something begin here?
Yeah. Well, then I might read a little bit from the bottom of page 111 through 113, because this is something else we both noticed and brought up, with the name of the trucking company, right? So his brother-in-law, he said, owned 28 trucks and was president of the Pyramid Trucking Company. Why did he name his company Pyramid? Asked Trout. I mean, this thing can go 100 miles an hour if it has to. It's fast and useful and unornamental. It's as up-to-date as a rocket ship. I never saw anything that was less like a pyramid than this truck. A pyramid was a sort of huge stone tomb which Egyptians had built thousands and thousands of years before. The Egyptians didn't build them anymore. The tombs looked like this, and tourists would come from far away to gaze at them. Why would anybody in the business of high-speed transportation name his business and his trucks after buildings which haven't moved an eighth of an inch since Christ was born? The driver's answer was prompt. It was peevish, too, as though he thought Trout was stupid to have to ask a question like that. He liked the sound of it, he said. Don't you like the sound of it? Trout nodded in order to keep things friendly. Yes, he said, it's a very nice sound.
In
Trout
order
said,
in order to keep things friendly.
to keep things friendly, right? So he doesn't have to get in a fight about it. Trout sat back and thought about the conversation. He shaped it into a story which he never got around to writing until he was an old man. It was about a planet where the language kept turning into pure music because the creatures were so enchanted by sounds. Words became musical notes. Sentences became melodies. They were useless as conveyors of information because nobody knew or cared what the meanings of words were anymore. So leaders in government and commerce, in order to function, had to invent new and much uglier vocabularies and sentence structures all the time, which would resist being transmuted to music. You married Kilgore? The driver asked, and then it goes on, from there. So it's just this little interlude where he has an idea for a story.
Mm-hmm.
And it's about this idea, and so this same idea about just liking the sound of something comes up later in the book with Excelsior fire extinguishers.
Mm-hmm.
And so, yeah, what did you think about that? This whole idea that he's got for a planet where the language turns into pure music. Do you think this is Vonnegut making any sort of deeper commentary about language and literature and maybe poetry, or is it just a funny aside?
Yeah, in my notes, I also highlighted this little section, and I asked the question, like, is this a symbol or is this like an anti-symbol, right?
Mm-hmm.
Anti-symbol being, things that authors could sort of sprinkle into a book that, it could be an interesting aside. It makes you kind of think about it. It could be this kind of like, false breadcrumbs where, you're kind of like taking down a dead end of your own kind of doing and curiosity. Or is there something more? I mean, it could be a symbol itself. Like you could obviously like make some kind of commentary about like politics, like being nothing more than just like people's words, right? People's just like pretty little languages, like back and forth, whatever you want to hear. Like, I mean, just think about how wild it is that we have a country where like roughly half of the population is so like entranced with like the kind of shit that Trump might say or do, right? They like hang on his words, and they love that so much. And then on the other hand, you have like a bunch of people that are like really into maybe they're not really into like Joe Biden, but let's say you have like an Obama type figure. They're really into the words as well, right? But ultimately, in both those eventualities, it's just words, right? Obama doesn't do shit, Trump doesn't do shit, Biden doesn't do shit, the next person's not going to do shit. It's more or less the same in that regard. So I feel like you could read this like any number of ways. You could even sort of keep it as an anti-symbol within the text, and it could still work. Although again, with the caveat that there's enough sort of like little stuff like this in the book where it doesn't totally cohere into something like totalizing, which is a bit of a detraction, right? Which is why it can't be something like Slaughterhouse-Five, for example. But I don't know, like what was your interpretation there?
Yeah, well, one other thing that occurred to me when I read that was two things. One, it gets a little bit at the idea that anybody can engage with the aesthetics of something, right? So this is a guy who starts a trucking company, and presumably a blue collarish type guy. Maybe he worked in trucking or manufacturing or something previously, and so now he's an entrepreneur. He starts this company, and he simply likes the sound of the word pyramid. That's an aesthetic judgment. He's deciding to base something that his livelihood is going to hinge on going forward, in a way, in the marketing of this company, on just the way a word sounds. So I think that's one thing, but I think the other aspect to it is, maybe that Vonnegut is saying, again, this is kind of what artists do, right? Like a poet is going to put a word somewhere, or a painter is going to put a mark somewhere because it feels right, or they like the sound of it, they like the look of it. Vonnegut himself writing this book, or the narrator, as the however unreliable he might be, he's writing this book. Well, a lot of the things he's going to put in there, he just probably likes the sound of. That's part of his own style. So I just thought that was kind of again, one of these quick little, maybe blink and you miss it, but it's a little point that Vonnegut's making about how aesthetics work and inform, art, and also just the world around us, period, whether we really think that through very often or not. And then obviously, like, Trout makes it into this kind of absurdist idea where people can't get anything done because the language is so flowery and musical. But yeah, that's pretty much it. I just thought it's an interesting idea, interesting comment.
Yeah, I didn't think of it from the kind of aesthetics perspective, how it refers back to art, but I mean, it would be definitely in fitting with, some of the other arguments in this book. I have a comment on chapter 15, but unless you have anything before that, I could tackle that.
Yeah, go ahead and jump there.
Yeah, so chapter 15 is just this kind of like it's kind of like a bottleneck for everything, I guess, where first of all it's I think it's the longest chapter in the book. I think it's about 40 pages long, right, which is much longer than anything else here. And so Dwayne Hoover is just kind of like being like the bad, like, so to the extent, right, that he's also like a machine among machines, right? Although he at this point doesn't believe that he's a machine any longer, right? That he's the only one with free will. They're also like bringing up his bad chemicals, right? So the way that this alchemy is described in this book is, on the one hand, you have ideas, right, and both Vonnegut and Kilgore Trout, as well as like the narrator in this book, they are big believers in the powers of ideas. And on the other hand, the interface with human beings is people also have chemicals, right? And there's something that he, euphemistically calls bad chemicals, right? And I think this is like very effectively done, where we have like a Nazi flag here, and this is how it's being characterized. Dwayne certainly wasn't alone as far as having bad chemicals inside of him was concerned. He had plenty of company throughout all history. In his own lifetime, for instance, the people in a country called Germany were so full of bad chemicals for a while that they actually built factories whose only purpose was to kill people by the millions. The people were delivered by railroad trains. When the Germans were full of bad chemicals, their flag looked like this. Like, very kind of matter-of-fact statement. Here's what their flag looked like after they got well again. Right? Doesn't even bother, coloring it in. Right? It's just, it's kind of like you go from something that, I'm not sure if this is just kind of like, bias looking back, because we know the Nazis were bad, but there's like something really like unsettling about this image versus this totally blanked, denatured, sort of thing. After they got well again, they manufactured a cheap and durable automobile, which became popular all over the world, especially among young people. It looked like this. People called it the Beetle. A real beetle looked like this. The mechanical beetle was made by Germans. The real beetle was made by the creator of the universe. So he takes like this, historical event, and he condenses it essentially to, that kind of deterministic sort of thing, right? They were affected by bad chemicals. Now, these bad chemicals aren't just kind of like, innately you're born, innately you're a German, so you're going to be, you have a predilection towards Nazism, right? That's not what's happening. But he's saying that all human beings have certain chemicals. Once that starts to interface with a certain kind of idea or a certain set of ideas, you will eventually get an outcome like Nazism, right? And the way that this kind of like it sort of like pays respect to history as a causal chain. But I just found it like a very interesting way to discuss human beings, and how just very quickly, right? Because as soon as the war's over, right, as if by magic, right? You change the flag, and then you start doing this. You start making this car, which looks so, unthreatening, and looks like so kind of like, the exact opposite of what you experienced. And all that you had was, the passage of time, the passage of ideas, a new way to interface with these chemicals, which, could be good, bad, neutral, whatever. Anyway, I don't know if you have any comments on that, but I found that very kind of like set of interesting asides.
Yeah, I don't think I have anything further there. My other moments to draw out of chapter 15, just really quick, at bottom of page 155, they talk about this character that Trout came up with called Ralston Valentine, who was the son of a safecracker, and he sandpapered his fingertips like his dad, but he wasn't a safecracker. Ralston was so good at touching women the way they wanted to be touched that tens of thousands of them became his willing slaves. They abandoned their husbands or lovers for him in Trout's story, and Ralston Valentine became president of the United States thanks to the votes of women. So just kind of a funny little lampooning of the U.S. and our democratic system, where, it's kind of based on trite things or things that are just so it's oriented around celebrity or who can do things that are really kind of inconsequential in a larger sense, but people just become fans for whatever reason. And then where Harry LeSabre, who's another character we haven't really talked about at all, but he's a sales manager at Dwayne Hoover's Pontiac dealership. And this chapter is going on in the context of Hawaiian Week, which is supposed to be kind of like, a fun promo at the dealership. But Dwayne gets upset at Harry's attitude and his dress and all this kind of stuff, and they're trying to liven things up. But on page 168, Harry is talking with his, just previous to that, he's talking with his wife, and they talk, I guess they have a black maid, right? And so, they use the word reindeer as code for black people. And it's, Vonnegut makes it clear, both directly and indirectly throughout the book, that like Midland City and Shepherdstown is a pretty intensely racist place. It's got really racist history, some of which is like really brutal. And then, so they're just kind of talking about this. And then on page 168, they're having like a banal conversation, but it says, the reindeer problem was essentially this: nobody white had much use for black people anymore, except for the gangsters who sold the black people used cars and dope and furniture. Still, the reindeer went on reproducing. There were these useless big black animals everywhere, and a lot of them had very bad dispositions. They were given small amounts of money every month, so they wouldn't have to steal. There was talk of them giving them very cheap dope, too, to keep them listless and cheerful and uninterested in reproduction. The Midland City Police Department and the Midland County Sheriff's Department were composed mainly of white men. They had racks and racks of submachine guns and 12-gauge automatic shotguns for an open season on reindeer, which was bound to come. Listen, I'm serious, said Grace to Harry. This is the asshole of the universe. Let's split to a condominium on Maui and live for a change. So they did. So just that one paragraph, where he takes a pretty serious aside to just succinctly talk about, still the modern day, perception of black people. And it hits pretty hard, I mean, it's just a very concise way of summing up, a lot of these problems that we're seeing continue to persist.
Yeah. I mean, even this like comment, right, about, it's just accurate, like, especially with hindsight, right? It's not controversial anymore to say this, right? Nobody white had much use for black people anymore, except for the gangsters who sold the black people used cars and dope and furniture. So the gangsters that we're talking about, we're not just talking about like, random black gangsters. We're not talking about like crime in that kind of visible way. We're talking about, any like used car salesman, right? That would, and, the type of people that would be forced to get used cars in the same way that, 2008, the type of people that were forced to get subprime mortgages, right? Because this was the only line of credit that was available. So you simply go for it. And even
toward the bottom there, listen, I'm serious. This is the asshole of the universe. Let's split to a condominium on Maui and live for a change. So they did, which I think is pretty much the last we hear of the LeSabres, you know?
Yeah.
Just an indictment on yet another approach to dealing with this problem, right? Just ignore it, leave. And their idea is to go buy a condo on Maui and live, that's in italics, live for a change. But we kind of know what they must mean by that, right?
Mm-hmm.
It's drink Mai Tais and golf every day.
Mm-hmm.
And it's still just a really poor use of a life, an excuse for a life. But to them, that's, it's like the dream. That's something that's better than what they have right now.
Yeah.
Just Vonnegut, skewering American culture yet further there. So,
yeah. And I mean, there's like a bunch of other things still that we could like page 142, when we have like the waitress, right, speaking to Dwayne. So this was because their English teachers would wince and cover their ears and give them flunking grades and so on whenever they failed to speak like English aristocrats before the First World War. Also, they were told that they were unworthy to speak or write their language if they couldn't love or understand incomprehensible novels and poems and plays about people long ago and far away, such as Ivanhoe. The Black people would not put up with this. They went on talking English every which way. They refused to read books they couldn't understand on the grounds that they couldn't understand them. They would ask such impudent questions as "Wherefore I want to read no Tale of Two Cities, wherefore?" Right? And it's just sort of like ends there, right? This is also like kind of, trapped between the ellipses, right?
Yeah.
And like this is on the one hand, it's like, this kind of image, I could see a lot of white people responding to it like, oh, well, why don't Black people just do this reading? Why don't they just, get better at it? Why don't, blah, blah, blah. And Vonnegut, on the one hand, he sort of like understands this, right? And it's almost as if like there is a kind of reader out there of this book, right, that would take this characterization as either an attack on Black people, or it would kind of like gel with their own kind of biases about non-whites. On the other hand, this is like Vonnegut, simply saying nothing tangible was given to Black people to make them understand this this portion of the white world. Right. There's nothing within these books that is useful to them, to the extent that, it's not useful to white people either. It's even less useful to Blacks. And instead of just, going along with it, we have this response, whoa, why am I going to read this, this thing? Right. And this is sarcastically characterized as impudent. Whereas in fact, like it's likely the correct answer from someone that says that I really have nothing of interest here for myself, right? And the way that you would address this is not to shame people. You would address this by changing the internal realities that allow the state of affairs, right? Where Wafo is the most logical response as opposed to any number of larger responses. Although, just like I said with Ethan Pinch a few nights ago, I'm also very skeptical of this idea of if we have like any kind of like Marxist style equality. I don't think that the majority of people will end up suddenly becoming interested in using their leisure time for good. I think we will simply get an office space situation where you come upon, suddenly all this money and you say that right now, my dream is to wake up and to do nothing, right? Simply because that, like, I think that's just the inclination of most people. And that's not going to change without serious cybernetic interventions. But yeah, like, like there's tons of like, racial commentary here. And a lot of it, honestly, like if this was written today, like, like this would be so like considered non-politically correct. And yet it's the kind of commentary that actually tells you what is going on in the world, right? All the people that are, saying that they in fact want this change or that change or that change. Here's the actual description of reality that they, on the other hand, don't want to deal with.
Yeah. Again, I know I'm being a bit selfish here. We're up on noon, so do we want to keep kind of ripping through?
Yeah. For those that don't know, he wants to watch a soccer match.
That's right.
He wants to give up grade R for soccer. Well, I'm also trying to get out of here because I'm going to take a very nice long bike ride.
Yeah.
So where do you want to, like, what do you have next?
My next thing was like kind of the introduction, the physical introduction of the narrator into the Holiday Inn on page 197. Right. And he wears these, the lenses were mirrors to anyone looking my way. Anyone wanting to know what my eyes were like was confronted with his or her own twin reflections. Where other people in a cocktail lounge had eyes, I had two holes into another universe. I had leaks. And you had highlighted Vonnegut's use of the word leaks for mirrors. So, asking why that works so well and why he like continues to use it so much. First of all, I mean, I don't know why, but that illustration just like made me laugh so hard when I saw it. I mean, it's just one among all the other ones he does, but like imagining someone that looks kind of like Kurt Vonnegut sitting in a cocktail lounge at a Holiday Inn in Indiana wearing those sunglasses. It's just like, I don't know, it's hilarious to me. I like have this mental image and it makes me laugh. But as far as like using the word leaks, I think that, man, like, why does that work well for mirrors, and why does he insist on talking about a mirror being like a window into another universe? Frankly, I don't really know. It's kind of a hard thing for me to pinpoint. I guess that,
but like it makes sense though, is the thing, right? Like from a writerly perspective, the word leak, like you could justify it, right? It's clever, right? But what is it about it that's clever?
Yeah,
you know what I mean?
Yeah, no, it does work well. I think that maybe even the idea, like the way that he presents it is it's a window into another universe, but that you would leak into that universe, like because mirrors are so common in the modern day. You look at yourself in a mirror every day, presumably, at a bare minimum, just in the bathroom or in your house. But then there's skyscrapers with windows. There's people wearing sunglasses you see yourself in. You're in your car, you look at yourself in mirrors, right? So like now, modern day, there are all of these little leaks into another space and another universe. And maybe even because the world is either upside down or turned a different way when you look in a mirror, or if you try to read in a mirror. Like just yesterday, I was getting my hair cut and there was a TV on behind me.
I could tell. I was going to say, very nice fucking hair. I wish I had hair as thick and luxurious as yours at this age.
Yeah. Hey, I'm trying to ride it while I've got it. You know what I mean? But like, I was trying to read what's it called? The dialogue at the base. That's, oh my God. Like the subtitles, right? There were subtitles on, and I was looking at it through the mirror in the barber's chair, and it's like, you can't really read it, but so it makes everything kind of weird and different. Like it's, I think it was the Food Network or whatever. So it's like this banal thing. I mean, I know what it is, but it's all presented to you in this different way. So I don't know. I think it's just a clever little way that Vonnegut's saying, reality can change. It can warp. It can immediately take you somewhere else through.
And I mean, like, so it's like a couple of things, like, just like literary history, right? I mean, we all know like Alice in Wonderland, Through the Looking Glass, all of that. So there's this like classic idea that got mirrors like as a kind of portal into another world. And the word leak, right? I mean, leak implies there is something coming from, there's like some kind of like foreign interference, right? Like you have like you have like something coming from somewhere that doesn't belong, right? Like a leak from a ceiling or whatever. Same thing with this idea, right? Because I mean, it is clever, right? It does kind of like stain your brain a little bit. Like ever since I first read this book, like I've always remembered this thing, like this idea of a leak as a mirror. Like it also obviously is like similar to what goes on in Cat's Cradle, right, where there's like an entire kind of invented vocabulary, which is also clever, but for a different reason. It's clever, in the kind of like Tin Pan Alley kind of thing, right? Like anyway, I think that's enough about that.
Yeah. And then the next thing I had was page 226 with Rabo Karabekian defending himself. And
what page is that?
226.
226. Okay.
Because another little subtle commentary that Vonnegut's making on the art world. By now, people in Midland City know that Karabekian's been paid $50,000 for this painting that was procured, I think, by Barrytron, the head of Barrytron. It wasn't Elliot Rosewater that bought the painting, I don't think.
Barrytron, the company?
Yeah, the guy that runs it. I forget his actual name in the book. But anyway, so it's 50 grand, which is way more money than any of them have ever seen and will ever see for the labor they do. And they're jealous of how little it seems that Karabekian worked to make that much money. And he's also just sort of an asshole on top of that, right? Like in his interactions with people for the most part. I think he gets upset at Bonnie McMahon for saying breakfast of champions when she serves martinis, right? He kind of like brings that up. So anyway, and he offends by saying that he's not that impressed with Mary Alice Miller, the young female swim champion who was like Midland City's main famous person or whatever. But then on page 226, well, we don't think much of your painting. I've seen better pictures done by a 5-year-old. Karabekian slid off his bar stool so he could face all those enemies standing up. He certainly surprised me. I expected him to retreat in a hail of olives, maraschino cherries, and lemon rinds, but he was majestic up there. Listen, he said so calmly. I have read the editorial against my painting in your wonderful newspaper. I have read every word of the hate mail you have been thoughtful enough to send to New York. This embarrassed people some. The painting did not exist until I made it, Karabekian went on. Now that it does exist, nothing would make me happier than to have it reproduced again and again and vastly improved upon by all the 5-year-olds in town. I would love for your children to find pleasantly and playfully what it took me many angry years to find. I now give you my word of honor, he went on, that the picture your city owns shows everything about life which truly matters, with nothing left out. It is a picture of the awareness of every animal. It is the immaterial core of every animal, the I am to which all messages are sent. It is all that is alive in any of us, in a mouse, in a deer, in a cocktail waitress. It is unwavering and pure, no matter what preposterous adventure may befall us. A sacred picture of St. Anthony alone is one vertical, unwavering band of light. If a cockroach were near him, or a cocktail waitress, the picture would show 2 such bands of light. Our awareness is all that is alive and may be sacred in any of us. Everything else about us is dead machinery. I have just heard from this cocktail waitress here, this vertical band of light, a story about her husband and an idiot who is about to be executed at Shepherdstown. Very well. Let a 5-year-old paint a sacred interpretation of that encounter. Let that 5-year-old strip away the idiocy, the bars, the waiting electric chair, the uniform of the guard, the gun of the guard, the bones and meat of the guard. What is that perfect picture which any 5-year-old can paint? 2 unwavering bands of light. Ecstasy bloomed on the barbaric face of Rabo Karabekian, which is just a really nice line right there, like musically. Citizens of Midland City, I salute you, he said. You have given a home to a masterpiece. Dwayne Hoover, incidentally, wasn't taking any of this in. He was still hypnotized, turned inward. He was thinking about moving fingers, writing, and moving on, and so forth. He had bats in his bell tower. He was off his rocker. He wasn't playing with a full deck of cards. And that's how the chapter ends. It's chapter 19. So, yeah, I mean, just kind of an interesting, like, Karabekian's not a sympathetic character. And then this is like him getting all, pissy and trying to defend his, I think it was like some avocado colored house paint was the main background. And then it was like some security tape or bright tape that he made as one vertical band to represent St. Anthony or whatever. And so it's kind of, I think Vonnegut is addressing the modern art world and the outrageous sums that some of these artworks command and that like wealthy patrons are willing to pay for when it really doesn't appear much has gone into it. But yeah, like a slight defense of the fact that, at least an artist might have some kind of intention behind their artwork, but that
he's trying to give a little bit of empathy there.
Yeah, he is, because the whole, like, my 5-year-old could do the same thing, which I think, like, you and I and others have argued in the past, like with abstract expressionism, like it often does seem to be that way, and maybe literally is that way. But yeah, there is like some defense of the fact that, like, he's saying, well, at least there is thought behind this, even though you don't think so. I did have kind of intention. Now, whether it's well done and et cetera, I mean, that's what can be debated. But just kind of an interesting monologue there from Karabekian. I don't know if you had any other thoughts on that.
Yeah, I mean, it's a kind of like, like self-defense that on the one hand, like it's memorable, right? In fact, like this image, right, this unwavering band of light, after Karabekian mentions it, it comes up again and again, like as a kind of, it becomes throughout the rest of the text. There's like about 70 pages after this, it becomes itself a kind of like little controlling metaphor, right? Which was like a nice touch. But like in this defense, like it's memorable, right? It's well written. But Vonnegut would know this as the writer, right? It's also like a very kind of like solipsistic defense, right? To the extent that any kind of abstract expressionism can exist and can be defended, it will always be on these terms, right? It will be like, well, I was trying to do this or that thing, in this drawing, but it's always going to be very kind of reflexive. It's always going to be self-referential. If it is like a reference to like something that is actually on the canvas, not that you can't make references to what's on the canvas, I mean you do, but it's always going to like pale in comparison to all this other stuff that you could make surrounding, again, all the like internal stuff that people normally come to bear, right? And like it gives it empathy, right? But then on the other hand, I think Vonnegut is sort of like like there's this kind of like bedazzling, right, of the reader, where you could easily come away, like let's say that you're a bad reader, you could easily come away with this thinking like, oh yeah, I finally get it. Abstract expressionism is like fucking wonderful, right? This is like the best thing ever. But again, just literally reading this is this is a very, very solipsistic defense. There's almost no reference to the canvas, and because that's the thing, if you were to make references to the canvas, it wouldn't be as interesting, right? Because otherwise it would be painted to the canvas and then telling everybody, see, no, this is Anthony, this is Anthony, this is Saint Anthony, this is a band of light, this is a band of light, this is the band, and it just wouldn't work, right? So it gives it the empathy, but it doesn't go all the way like into the territory, let's call it forgiveness. Let's be totally condescending here. It does not forgive Abeck's expression, Abeck's, right?
Right. And even the line I said it's a nice sounding line, is a bit of a giveaway, like ecstasy bloomed on the barbaric face of Rabo Karabekian, and then he just does this, I salute you. You've given home to a masterpiece. Like it's so pompous, and it's just he's just being such an ass, right? So
And one thing, like the last cliches in the chapter, I mean, these are literally cliches, but they work very well in this context, right? So I think it's worth mentioning. So we're talking about Dwayne Hoover. We know that he's like slowly losing his mind after this chapter, right? This was 15. No, this wasn't 15. 19. But after this chapter is when he starts kind of like going off on this rampage. Right before that happens, and it's like a comical rampage, right? And this is a comic, even this like defense of Abex, right? It's like very comic, itself as well, right? And it's phrased as, he had bats in his bell tower, he was off his rocker, he wasn't playing with a full deck of cards. I think very often when you have like cliches like that, just stacking up, and the way that Vonnegut sometimes does it, because there's like so much comedy involved, it's forcing you to like treat these statements literally. And you often like, people often, like with a cliche, you often forget what it's actually saying, right? I mean, and it's kind of like funny when you think about it, like he wasn't playing with a full deck of cards, right? This like total, euphemism, right? And like this is true of a lot of cliches. Like there are ways where you could use cliches in a Vonnegut-esque way, in a prosaic way, that makes them not only justifiable but also like funny, right? Then after this, you just have this like total comic meltdown where he goes on this rampage, people get hurt, and maybe we just wrap things up there now.
Yeah. Well, and maybe we can just briefly talk about the end of the book before the epilogue, because you already highlighted the epilogue, where we've got more scenes of the narrator addressing Trout directly and this kind of stuff. But the final, on page 288, kind of the final scene before that is after Hoover's rampage. Trout is riding in the Martha super ambulance, along with some other people. And so it just says, and so on. Kilgore Trout now peeled strips and patches of plastic from his burning shins and feet in the ambulance. He had to use his uninjured left hand, etc., in big block letters. And so, there's even a moment where earlier Vonnegut addresses, kind of being called out for his consistent use of so and listen and so on and etc. And it's him doing it as the narrator, which was on page 234. He uses that same block, etc. And it says, and it is in order to acknowledge the continuity of this polymer that I begin so many sentences with and so, and end so many paragraphs with and so on. And so on. It's all like an ocean, cried Dostoevsky. I say it's all like cellophane, which I just think is a hilarious line, and him once again using something like banal and kind of gross and modern and corporate-y, right? Like cellophane, this plastic thing that we wrap things in to preserve them or whatever. And that's the whole universe in a way, is all like cellophane. So then, at the end, he's like peeling away this stuff that it's the runoff, right? It's like the pollution runoff from Barytron that's in the creek.
And then his legs become like, covered in this plastic, right?
Yeah.
It's like burning his shins. Yeah,
exactly. So, but it's just so like he had to use his uninjured left hand, etc. I mean, to me, that it was like a little bit of a filmic ending. Like you can have this image of all these people in the ambulance, and the camera kind of zooms in on Trout, and he's just sitting there sort of like totally disheveled, disgruntled more than ever, and he's just picking away at this plastic. His right hand has had a fingertip bitten off, and he's got it bandaged and bloody, and then he's just kind of slowly peeling away the plastic, and then just kind of like a zoom back out over Midland City or something. It's like, etc. And I think it's a pretty good end to the book before the epilogue. I think if Vonnegut hadn't put an epilogue in, it would function as a nice ending, and a little bit. It's kind of just, it's abrupt, right? There's no tying up of any loose ends. It's just Hoover goes on the rampage. Everyone's dealing with the fallout from that, and then it's over.
This is why the epilogue, it does make it better, right? It does tie up some loose ends. It does sort of give, a finality and, an arc, especially to the narrator, right? Which is this kind of, major thing. And just like very quickly back on page 214, so he says, I had no respect whatsoever for the creative works of either the painter or the novelist. I thought Karabakian, with his meaningless pictures, had entered into a conspiracy with millionaires to make poor people feel stupid. I thought Beatrice Kiesler had joined hands with other old-fashioned storytellers to make people believe that life had leading characters, minor characters, significant details, insignificant details, that it had lessons to be learned, tests to be passed, and a beginning, a middle, and an end, right? Perhaps it's a critique of some of the critique that I've been making here, right? Where, you do have some loose ends that aren't really dealt with. You do have some details that don't necessarily go anywhere in this book. You don't have this kind of like totalizing force that you have elsewhere. which, you know, and it's written in a nice way, right? As I approached my 50th birthday, I had become more and more enraged and mystified by the idiot decisions made by my countrymen. And then I had come suddenly to pity them, for I understood how innocent and natural it was for them to behave so abominably, and with such abominable results. They were doing their best to live like people invented in storybooks. This was the reason Americans shot each other so often. It was a convenient literary device for ending short stories and books. And I think it's like a very kind of a smart set of commentary, because I mean, like, you could say, like, literally, obviously it's not true, but you know, like, this is why art, you know, has any kind of power, right? It's to the extent that when you read, for example, a short story, you know, you are wondering of what relationship this has with reality, your day-to-day life, someone else's reality, the fabric of reality, some underlying reality. And I mean, this is just a very nice way of framing all of that, right? And when he talks about writing, he says, I'd resolved to write about life. I resolved to shun storytelling. I would write about life. Every person would be exactly as important as any other. All facts would also be given equal weightiness. Nothing would be left out. Let others bring order to chaos. I would bring chaos to order instead, which I think I have done, which this is exactly what art is, right? You have, you know, you could write literally about anything, right? You could be walking down the street, right? And it's now, you know, summer. You're going to see dead slugs all over the street. You could write about that. There's an almost limitless number of topics, right? And by its nature, it's chaotic. Not that it's, you know, chaotic in the sense that there's no reason for its occurrence, but it's not. There's no reason that is satisfying there, right? Just innately, with just the way that things are, there's no innately satisfying reason behind, you know, if you look at Andy Warhol sort of like taking a camera on the street, recording that for 8 hours and calling it a film. The reason why it doesn't really work as a film is there's nothing innately satisfying about an uninterrupted 8 hours of reality, right, or truth that's not ordered in any way, right? You have to do the ordering, right? Your hand has to be essentially that gardener.
Yep. Yeah, I think that's well said. And wrapping up with final comments, again, I think we both agree that it's an excellent novel. My main critique, I guess, would be, as we mentioned earlier, there are some scenes that could be trimmed, and I don't think the book would lose anything. You know, and I don't, off the top of my head, I don't even know that I could highlight them directly, but I think as a reader would go through, and then you're kind of rehashing the novel in your head, you would think, yeah, some of that stuff, you know, while it might be funny or entertaining or well written, whatever, it didn't necessarily need to be there. And that's part of what makes Slaughterhouse so good, is how concise and dense it is. But it's an excellent book. It's very enjoyable to read, wildly entertaining in a lot of ways. I'm not sure how you could read it and not be entertained, I guess.
Yeah. We were gonna like briefly discuss the negative review that it received in the New York Times upon publication, but I don't think it's worth it. And honestly, I think you know, the failing New York Times has been bullied enough, right?
Well, and one thing that I noticed is, and maybe this was Vonnegut again, just being tongue in cheek, but he actually, on my edition, he pulls a quote from that review, but makes it positive.
Wait, let me see.
Yeah, I don't know if you have that on yours, but
I didn't even realize that was from the New York Times. Yeah, marvelous. Vonnegut wheels out all the complaints about America and makes them seem fresh, funny, outrageous, hateful, and lovable.
Right, and if he attributes it to them. So,
but honestly, that's also a comment on just the nature of reviews in general, right?
Yeah,
they're so like I remember when I was a kid and like reading like positive reviews of like all sorts of should poetry and not knowing any better. And I would think like, I wonder, what am I missing here? Like, what am I not understanding here? And, you could turn, almost anything, positive or negative, twist it around, because in almost all situations, people are never critics are never talking about what ought to be discussed, right? They're never doing it. Yeah. So it ultimately doesn't even matter.
Yeah. I like I said to you in the show notes, that review it's just brutal. It doesn't address anything of substance about the book.
Yeah.
And the author of it's talking about struggling with so many and so ons and et ceteras and listens, that, these are devices Vonnegut he uses them all the time. So it just, I don't know, it comes across as sort of self-serving and just completely inwardly directed at the reviewer's own needs from a novel or something. It's it's not good. It's not good.
For book reviews, there needs to be a word count minimum.
Yeah, there should be.
Or for any reviews in general, like fucking like Jonathan Rosenbaum, like with his like literally a fucking like 5 sentences on another woman, right? And we're gonna get a taste of what the movie really is, right? With 5 sentences. We shouldn't do that. This was also an exceptionally short review. That should never, I mean, you just can't, like there's a difference between a positive review, negative review, and a good or bad review, right? A bad review misses the point. A good review misses the point. Being positive or negative is beside the point.
Yeah.
Okay, so we could end here. I guess we'll be coming back with next time that we talk, it should be sonnets from the Portuguese, Elizabeth Barrett Browning. Lots and lots of just individually close readings for people to follow along with the text with us. Thank you guys for watching. If you haven't hit like, please do so. If you're not subscribed, please do so. And we will see you again very soon.
Oh my God.